Well, hello! In parts 1 and 2 of this series, I sort of set the groundwork by talking about the characters, the lore, and the world building of Fire Emblem Fates, and how these things all just kind of fail on an inherent level. But that was just me setting the stage, because all of this yapping, and I still haven't talked in depth about the actual events of the on-screen story. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, I have a lot of thoughts. Buckle in and grab a snack, because this is going to be a long video. Let's start with the first 6 chapters before the events of each route proper. Firstly, the prologue chapter. This entire sequence serves no purpose. The game starts up in a dream foretelling the events immediately before the Branch of Fate. This scene hasn't actually happened yet chronologically, and seems to serve little purpose. It's just a repeat of a part in chapter 6, but with no context. I suppose it's meant to be a callback to Awakening, which started with a very similar scene. But in Awakening, this is explained and serves a plot purpose, whereas here it just remains confusing and out of place. Perhaps it's meant to imply that Corrin inherited Mikoto's power of foresight, but first of all, what's the point of establishing this when Corrin never uses it again? And second, I just kinda hate the implication because Corrin did not need more plot powers. This entire prologue chapter also never comes up again. Even during chapter 6 itself, and when Corrin meets the Hoshiden royals later, they never bring up any of this being familiar at all. It really seems like this was some kind of last-minute addition into the game, considering how Corrin just conveniently forgets about it. Immediately after this, we have chapter 1. Pretty much this entire chapter is Corrin waking up, having a conversation with their multiple retainers, and then going to train with Xander. This, to me, is really an establishing moment for Corrin. How do you think it comes across to your audience if you introduce a character waking up, surrounded by multiple servants who all wait on them hand and foot? Usually, a writer would use this to establish a character that is meant to be spoiled and stuck up. But this isn't how we're meant to think of Corrin. We're meant to think of Corrin as kind, if not lonely, in the fortress. So this is probably the stupidest way to introduce them, especially since they've been imprisoned here their whole life and this is a bad thing, and the game knows that this is a bad thing. But if you want to effectively get across that the fortress is this cold and isolating place, maybe just don't have them wake up surrounded by servants who immediately do everything they can to comfort Corrin. This scene also sets the game's tone as coddling. The following scene with their siblings at least makes more sense in context, since that's their family, so no shit, they care about Corrin, but the scene with Corrin waking up has no such excuse. Even with the following scene with Corrin's family, though, it's still janky as hell. Ah yes, let me tell you outright what my personality trait is and my relationship to you so the player will know instead of just letting them figure it out by showing them. What you have as a result of this is dialogue that is unnatural, where no real human being talks like this. It is, at the very least, effective at what it set out to do, which is to introduce you to the Nohrian squad and show you why you should care about them. Something that both of these scenes show, though, is that too much attention is given to Corrin at the expense of other characters. They are always the subject of the conversation, and this is something that stays true for the rest of the game. We get taken to the castle where Garen talks about being evil, gives Corrin the Genglari, and tells them to execute some prisoners. A lot of people give this part a lot of crap because of the sword looking obviously evil, so why wouldn't Corrin see that it's obviously evil? And that's something that I actually really don't agree with. We as an audience can afford to be genre savvy, since fiction tends to follow specific rules and tropes that we can identify. But the characters don't have that privilege, so just saying it looks evil doesn't mean anything. In real life, this would be like saying your goth friend who spends too much time in cemeteries is clearly a supervillain. It's just completely silly. There is, of course, the part where the sword drags Corrin into the canyon, but that's never what I see people bring up to support this. After this, Leo bails us out, which is perfectly fine on its own. If you're trying to make it feel like Corrin and their family are a tight-knit group who are all in this together, especially in the face of Garen very obviously not having their best interests at heart, then having Leo help us out to get Corrin out of a sticky situation is a good way to show that. In a vacuum, anyways. But when people continue to bail Corrin out again and again throughout the course of the story, every time Corrin is faced with the possibility of doing something morally questionable, it becomes a massive problem. But since this is the first time this has happened and serves a decent purpose, I'll let this slide for now. The next chapter is when we go to the bottomless canyon with Hans and a couple of Corrin's retainers, and Hans is here to pick an obviously unprovoked fight with Hoshiden soldiers under orders from Garen. I want you to keep in mind that you most likely already chose a route, and this is the start of the game telling you in bold letters that one of the routes is wrong actually. Gunter then does a very literal interpretation of what every other Jagan in the series does metaphorically and falls off. The Ganglari then tries to drag us into the canyon, even though I'm still not entirely sure why it does this, unless the plan was to get Corrin into Vala so Anonkos can control Corrin directly. Sure, I guess that plan makes a lot more sense than just hoping Corrin gets saved by Lilith, kidnapped to Hoshido, and having them unknowingly suicide bomb their mother, but what a vague way to present it. Speaking of which, Corrin gets saved by Lilith, kidnapped to Hoshido, and unknowingly suicide bombs their mother, and also probably like a few civilians too. And this also introduces a weird issue that some of these opening chapters have, which is that the pacing is all over the place. The next couple of chapters have like 10 extremely important things happen in the span of around 15 minutes when excluding gameplay. Corrin is taken to Hoshido, where they learn they're adopted, meet their real family, and learn that they're actually Hoshidan royalty. They establish that the throne has special powers that are going to be plot important later. Their mom dies in the town square. Corrin finds out they can transform into a dragon, learns to control their dragon form literally 30 seconds later. They regain their memories from before they were kidnapped by Garen. They find out that the Yato is in the statue in the town square. Corrin gets the Yato, and then they find out that actually her dying was part of some prophecy that she foresaw, so it's okay, even though barely any of this comes up again. If you didn't follow all of that, that's okay, because this is all way too fast. Going through all of this in a bit more detail, Corrin meeting their blood family could have been a very emotionally resonant moment if they'd only given it more time to really settle in. There's a scene with Makoto where she brings Corrin to their old bedroom and explains how they couldn't bring themselves to remove anything that was already there after Corrin was kidnapped, because it would have been like accepting that they were really gone. This is nice, I just wish it had more room to breathe. There's also the throne having plot-important powers, which I guess is fine by itself until put alongside the rest of the world building with the special magical barrier, ooh. After which it begins to feel like yet another thing trying to scream into your ear that Hoshido is better than Nor in every way. This leads to the scene at the town square where a Valite soldier shows up, takes Corrin's sword, and blows everyone up, Makoto included. This is what allows Corrin to regain their memories, which, to be honest, they shouldn't even have in the first place, since I'm pretty sure they got kidnapped when they were a toddler. I guess it's possible that they got kidnapped when they were a little older, but this presents another problem where they don't tell you about the timeline of events ever. You're just left giving your best guess. And because we've only had one chapter to actually know Makoto, it all feels extremely hollow, and it doesn't help that everybody in the scene is so oddly calm about it. Except Takumi, I guess, but he's always like this. We needed to spend more time with this character so that we'll actually feel something when she does the typical Fire Emblem parent thing and dies tragically. Not to sound like an absolute Fire Emblem zoomer, but take for example Three Houses, which gives us plenty of time to get to know Geralt, Byleth's father, and get attached to him. So when he dies, even if anyone who's played a game from this series is going to see it coming from a mile away, it still feels important and impacts the player. Makoto's death is also just strange because of how little it affects any of the dialogue after this scene. Nobody talks about Makoto after this chapter outside of supports, and something this important should never be hidden behind an optional scene that most people won't unlock. Something that's going to show up more than once is that Fates reserves important information and characterization to supports only. I understand that the point of supports is extra characterization, but there's some things that really are just too important to never show up outside of it. The main characters of Birthright are literally her kids. How is it that this never comes up? It would be a perfect opportunity at certain points during Birthright for Corrin to have a heart-to-heart with the Hoshidan royals or something, and yet they all just kind of don't acknowledge her. I've heard some people say that Birthright's story is supposed to be a revenge plot in the wake of a lack of any blood ties, but it's a little hard to make a revenge plot if you never actually talk about the fucking revenge plot. What was even the purpose of killing her at all? By doing this, you completely sever the blood connection between the Hoshidans and Corrin. If you already know that Corrin isn't related to the Hoshidan royals, there is no reason to pick Birthright, but this wouldn't have been the case if Makoto had stayed alive throughout the story. Of course, the real reason she dies in the story is so that the barrier comes down so that the plot can move forward. The stress from the events of Makoto's death is what causes Korin to transform into a dragon, and I know I've already covered this in part 1, so I'll just be skipping over it. It's just disappointing to me that this is never relevant and is immediately solved. It turns out that the Yato was inside the statue, even though it's never explained as to how it got there. Does this imply that the person who made the statue put it there? I have no idea, it's just another instance of the game refusing to explain shit. Korin gets the Yato, and then we learn that Makoto foresaw this entire event. If she foresaw it, then what's the logic behind still just allowing it to happen instead of taking some kind of preventative measures? As it is, it comes across as her allowing herself to die, knowing this will cause the barrier to go down and put her people at serious risk. It also seems like an easy out, so the characters will know it wasn't Korin's fault. Korin has been stuck inside the fortress their whole life, and for them to be ignorant of what would happen makes sense to me. But the characters don't know that. But instead of having all of this progress naturally, wherein they come to the conclusion with evidence that Korin can in fact be trusted, and actually see them build a relationship with Korin, they just lazily put a cap on it. Something I'll be a lot more critical of when I cover Birthright is how underbaked Korin's dynamic is with the Hoshiden royal family, even though it really doesn't seem like it should be. They've spent all this time wanting Korin to come home, but they're only just now realizing that the person who came back is a stranger, but this is never explored whatsoever. I'm not saying that they should all hate Korin or be cold to them, I think that would be too far on the opposite side of the spectrum, but I would have liked to see them deal with those conflicting emotions in more detail. And like I said, all of this happens within the span of like 15 minutes. Prologue lasts for 6 chapters, but I honestly feel as though we needed more, with the time split evenly between both Nor and Hoshido. Both so that all of these events have some time to breathe and sink in, and so that we've actually known the Hoshiden royals for more than 1 chapter before the route split, since they're supposed to be the whole crux of your decision. It also needed to establish the state of both kingdoms and their reasoning for going to war, but especially for Nor. We only learn way later on in a route that isn't the Nor route why Nor is actually going to war. There's something extremely stupid about that. The Branch of Fate is supposed to be the setup for the story, and yet doesn't give you any of the necessary information to orient yourself, even though that's the entire point of setting up a story. Of course, we should also think about how the choice fits into Korin themselves. From an objective point of view, Birthright seems to make the most sense. Something, we're the good guys. I don't need to explain that one. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would Korin choose Nor? Are they stupid? And from the perspective of us, someone outside of the story and separated from that world, it's easy for us to say that we would simply make the correct and moral decision. Korin doesn't have this objective and impartial view, and that's honestly a strength of the writing. Korin has been locked up in a tower their whole life with Xander, Camilla, Leo, and Elise as pretty much their only company. Their Norian family is very important to them, and not just because of some silly little shared chromosomes. They may not agree with Nor's actions, but it makes complete sense for their background that they're loyal to their Norian family above all else. Which just leaves Revelation. You might be asking me, once again, why would Korin refuse to fight and make both families hate them? Are they stupid? Well, kinda, but again, this makes sense. Korin is naive and idealistic and wants to find a way to have everyone kiss and make out instead of killing each other to death. Korin cares, at least to some extent, about everyone on that battlefield. Of course they can't choose. I suppose this means it's time for me to actually cover each route individually. Let's start with the one that is probably the most universally shat upon for its writing, Conquest, and get that one out of the way first. So before we get into the nitty-gritty with any specific plot points, let's start with the big elephant in the room. As you've probably already gathered, this game does an absolutely miserable job at justifying Nor. So basically, you're fighting for the villains. Everyone who knows even a little bit about Fates knows that Nor is irredeemably evil. You know, I know, your next door neighbor knows, your grandma's dog knows.
Hans, are we the baddies?
You'd think that when Nor and Garen are pretty much exclusively characterized as being shitty, that the plot of Conquest would be centered around changing the country from the inside, some kind of revolution plot or similar to it. Yeah, well, that sure would be nice, wouldn't it? Nope, you basically just follow exactly what Garen wants you to do for the entire runtime. I've heard some people defend this by saying, oh, well, it's supposed to be a villain route. I think this is a bullshit argument. I'll get back to why that is, though. Now, luckily, the pacing of Fates does actually slow down to a reasonable degree once you choose a route. Unluckily, That doesn't make things any better. We pretty much immediately go back to the castle, where we are told by Garen to go quell a rebellion from the Ice Tribe completely alone. To their credit, the Norian siblings do protest this decision, and some of your friends do show up later to help. But the fact that they're questioning it now makes a lot less sense when they end up being so wishy-washy about Garen later on. I suppose the point of the Ice Tribe arc is to test Corrin's morality, and whether they can still be peaceful under the influence of King Garen. From that perspective, I kinda like it, but the way this idea is presented is the actual worst. Almost every time you defeat an enemy in Conquest, you're not actually killing them, just defeating them. But considering that you're still waging war, this isn't particularly realistic. I find it hard to believe in any full-scale battle where the enemy is fully intent on killing you that you can manage to spare everyone. It just doesn't seem feasible. If you really wanted to go the pacifist route, have Corrin be shown doing everything they can to avoid the conflict in the first place, instead of entering the conflict and then everybody just being okay because Corrin says so. There are much better ways of implementing this pacifism than having the party throw their pointy sticks at a room full of enemy soldiers and then just saying everyone was fine afterwards. But since this is a video game and we need enemies to fight, I guess they didn't feel like doing that. I know it was supposed to be something to make Corrin a little less to blame in this route considering they're siding with Nor, but it does absolutely nothing to help this. Later in the story, people will still die as a result of Corrin's actions anyways, all while adding a whole lot of logistical issues. After the Ice Tribe, Corrin gets sent to Fort Dragonfall where they find Azura. I don't like that Azura's treatment in Hoshido, and especially her being kidnapped here in this chapter, is so transparently just a way for her to join during Conquest instead of like exploring this at all, and it inadvertently messes up a lot of things, namely the likability of certain Birthright characters. Anyway, we defend a port town from the nefarious Pineapple, and then it's time for us to fight Hinoka and talk to the Rainbow Sage. He says some stuff about how Corrin is the chosen one because they have the Yato. I have never liked the whole chosen one trope in the slightest. In my personal opinion, it's lazy and makes the character in question feel a whole lot less like they've earned it. Clichés like this exist for a reason, I suppose, even if in cases like this, I don't fully understand why people like it at all. But regardless of your opinion on the trope as a whole, I think this is a good example of how exactly to never approach it. Corrin being the chosen one is only ever relevant when the game wants other characters to trust Corrin without making Corrin prove themselves. It's entirely superfluous for this story and just seems to exist out of convenience. Characters will continually bring up the Yato as the sole reason to trust Corrin, even when Corrin is very clearly in the wrong. You see, Corrin was actually sent here to kill the Rainbow Sage, and the Rainbow Sage accepts it purely for this reason. Corrin refuses to kill him, and then he just gets a heart attack in the middle of the conversation and dies. Yeah, okay. At the end of the day, it's just a convenient coincidence that he drops dead for no reason, and sadly, this is going to become a recurring theme. Whenever Corrin is faced with the possibility of killing someone, they usually either commit suicide, get killed by somebody else, or literally just die on the spot for no reason, and this isn't going to be unique to just Conquest. Palace Makarath is next, and honestly, this part has always felt extremely out of place to me. Elise falls ill all of a sudden, and we need to get medicine at the palace for her, which is apparently the only place on the continent with the medicine. But everything that happens in this chapter is entirely separate from everything else in the story. It's basically just a filler episode. This illness never comes up again or affects anyone else and is very specific to this chapter. All it accomplishes is in establishing Ryoma as an absolutely terrible person because he tries to blackmail you into coming back to Hoshido by threatening to let Elise die, who, let me clarify, is a 14-year-old girl who is entirely defenseless because she cannot attack in her base canonical class. Chapter 13 rolls around, and this is probably one of the worst chapters in Conquest, which is kind of saying something. Just to summarize it, Corrin comes along to suppress another rebellion, this time at Sheev, and Sheev is apparently working alongside the Hoshidans to accomplish this. It basically becomes a gigantic disaster because Hans and the rest of the Norians fucking slaughter everybody there, civilians included, resulting in the biggest fucky-wucky Corrin commits in Fates. If you're a sane human being, you'd probably think that this should be a major turning point in the story where the characters finally say to themselves, hey, maybe we shouldn't follow follow Garen's orders anymore, and yeah, no, that's not what happens at all. It's basically framed as this big oh shit moment, and Corrin finally has the realization that they can't keep doing this. On paper, this is fine. By itself, it's a poor argument to say that it's bad writing for the main character to make awful decisions. Having your main character make mistakes is fine, dare I say preferable, if it makes sense that that's something that the character would do, and if that mistake, assuming it's big enough, is actually dealt with properly, which generally means having consequences for the character being stupid and horrible, and actually letting them learn from it. Corrin has been locked away their whole life prior. Their naivete most certainly isn't an excuse, they are still very much at fault, but it makes sense for them. Where it all falls apart is in how it fails to follow through. Corrin has this realization that they've essentially hit rock bottom, and yet nothing truly changes. They still follow Garen's orders, even if it is more begrudgingly than before. They remain as naive as ever and don't seem to ever learn that their cowardice towards Garen will only continue to result in tragedy. In literally any other story, this would so naturally be the turning point, and yet nothing. It all means nothing. That's why Chive sucks, not because Corrin was a stupid piece of shit, but because they don't learn anything from it and continue to be a stupid piece of shit for the rest of the game's runtime afterwards. Oh, and on an unrelated note, Azura states after Takumi leaves that he never would have been aggressive or cruel before unless something was seriously wrong, even though we know damn well from his fucking introduction before the route split that this is objectively untrue. Takumi also shoots Elise for no reason, because he's probably someone who punches walls. Moving on from that dumpster fire, we go to the local AMC. Our dad talks to us about how he's proud of us for eradicating the unarmed townspeople. No, that's not some kind of exaggeration, that is literally what he says. When I talk about a lack of nuance with Garen, I feel the need to emphasize that he says shit exactly like this every single time we talk to him. He just casually talks about executing us like every other cutscene with him, and everyone is just like, oh, silly grandpa, let's get you back to bed. Azura shows up at the theater as performer and sings what's apparently supposed to be a spell. Nobody recognizes her while she's on stage, and if I wanted to be charitable, I guess this could be excused by saying that when you're at a live theater, the stage is far away enough that you can't really make out individual faces. But I'd still have a bit of a hard time fully buying that, considering she's literally just in a color-swapped version of her normal outfit. And even disregarding that, you'd think that her extremely familiar voice and song would be enough to clue Corrin in. Perhaps it's some kind of magic, but they never imply that this is the case. We get an interaction between Corrin and Leo talking about how they might be able to sneak under Garen's nose to save the singers, and although I didn't bring it up, there was a certain interaction between Camilla and Corrin last chapter, with Camilla talking about how Garen may kill them if they step out of line, so it's best to stay silent. I know that this might sound like a somewhat strange thing to praise, and perhaps it's just because I had played Birthright right before this when recording footage for this video, but these little moments between Corrin and the other Norian royals are really nice. This is also a much better way of making Corrin a pacifist than non-lethally killing people, because there's actual thought being put into how they're doing it. The collective silent rebellion they have makes them feel very tightly knit in a way that the Hoshidan royals and Birthright completely fail at. I think it actually does a really good job of selling you on this bond that they have. And when Birthright has a grand total of what is essentially zero meaningful interactions between the cast members, it really does feel refreshing in comparison that Conquest is the one route that actually does put some effort into reminding you that the whole reason you chose a side at all was because of Corrin's connection with these people. We follow Azura into Vala and discover Gunter has just been chilling here the entire game. And as a side note, since in Birthright you never find Gunter in Vala, it's really funny to think that he's just stuck there forever because everyone forgot about him. Corrin asks Azura about where we are, and she doesn't tell us anything except that we can't talk about it while outside of it. Keep in mind that since we are currently in Vala, the Valite curse doesn't apply. Azura has this golden opportunity to tell us who the actual big bad is, and just says nothing. She doesn't even call it Vala, just some mysterious hidden land. She doesn't tell us about her connection to this place either, but not telling us about Anonkos feels really important for Corrin to know, because Anonkos is literally trying to kill everyone. She no longer has any actual reason for being cryptic, she's just leaving out necessary information for no reason other than I guess she just couldn't be bothered. She even has a line about wanting to tell Corrin the truth and doesn't for no reason at all. Azura then states that she found out that they can leave Vala by jumping off the floating islands. As they leave Vala, Corrin mentions how the idea of jumping off to get back to the canyon is frightening for them, even though they are literally a dragon with wings that can just save themselves if they wanted, though I'm starting to believe the wings are completely decorative considering how the story never thinks about it. And now, we can finally talk about the crystal ball, which I've been looking forward to because it really does perfectly summarize one of the most egregious issues with this game. The crystal ball itself is a small plot point that only shows up in this chapter, but it's the perfect example of how this game approaches its storytelling as a whole. Azura pulls out a crystal ball and says it has the ability to reveal the truth, that they only appear in Vala, that they can only be used by certain people, and that they break after use. Already this introduces a shit ton of questions. Where did she find it? Do they form naturally? When did she pick this up? Why didn't she bring multiple to convince everyone else, or show it while Corrin and all of the other Norian siblings were present? None of this will ever be explained because it wasn't thought of for more than 10 seconds. It was so obviously just thrown in so Corrin can know what's going on so that Azura can propose her master plan, which, trust me, we'll get to that. The trend here is that things are thrown into the story regardless of how much actual sense they make, for the express purpose of making the plot move along as smoothly as possible. Pretty much everything, from Azura's kidnapping at Fort Dragonfall, to the Yato, to Makoto dying, to the Deep Realms, to Xander having a brain made out of cheese. Almost everything exists thrown together in an absolutely unfathomable mess, with no care at all for how these things contradict each other or make their characters, regardless of faction, look like idiotic and terrible people, as an ultimate exercise in excuses merely to keep the story chugging along in a way that the writers don't have to think about any of it because they thought a particular plot point or type of fan service would be cool to put in. I think I've made my point with that, and sadly, the issues with this scene don't stop there. Shortly after, Azura tells us about her plan to get rid of Garen. Since Hoshido's throne has the power to reveal the truth, her plan is to get Garen on the throne so that everybody can see that he's a goo monster. And how does she plan on doing that, you ask? Well, by completely going along with Garen's plan and conquering Hoshido, potentially sacrificing an unimaginable amount of people in the process. Again, you can just get another crystal ball and show that to the Norian royals or something. And alongside that, why do you even need to reveal the truth before killing him? Corrin is around him all of the time, you can literally just stab him. Why is it even necessary for him to be a goo monster instead of just saying, yeah, it's because he's evil? They don't even have any way of knowing if the throne will actually do what they want it to when they're basing all of this on what is essentially a game of chance. No justification is given for why they have to prove he's a slime man, instead of just bringing up his genocidal tendencies as proof. I understand that to some, just saying, well, why didn't the character do this thing instead, may come across as really weak criticism, but I think it's kind of situational. Yeah, a lot of the time a character doing something that's dumb as shit is justified. Sometimes it makes sense given the current information the character has and what their personality is. But I don't think that's really the case here. More often than not, all of this just comes across as only happening because the writers didn't consider the possibility rather than as an intentional choice. And it's not like Corrin goes along because they don't want to turn on Garen or because of any emotional connection, because they're still planning on killing Garen, just in a more roundabout way. Look, it may be true that a lot of media criticism focuses too much on what it considers plot holes. When someone looks at a piece of fiction and says, well, why didn't they just think of doing a 360 flip into the wall while astral projecting to see where the enemy was 200 feet away while busting a nut as a distraction, which yes, that example is slightly exaggerated. I die inside because something like that is really easy to dismiss as obtuse enough that no one would think of it when put under pressure. But Fates legitimately doesn't even hold up to the most basic questions about its logistics before it begins to fall apart, and in that case, I think it's entirely justified to say that this is a plot hole. It's around this time that we start seeing a different side to Corrin as a character. Corrin has a tendency to put up this mask in front of Garen and his retainers, pretending to be this heartless good little soldier so that nobody suspects anything. I like seeing this different side to Corrin. It at least does something to give them a little extra dimension. Skipping ahead a little bit, because not much really happens for the next little while, on our way to invade Hoshido, we find our way to Mokashu. We learn that their leader, Kotaro, has taken a Hoshida ninja hostage so that Hoshido will surrender. Our party tells them that's not cool, and Kotaro decides to pick a fight over it. Except that Kotaro states that Garen promised him a chunk of land, and yet decides that the best thing to do is to make an enemy of Nor's royal family by not just, letting the hostage go. Not to mention that it's unrealistic to expect that Hoshido would surrender during an invasion over a single soldier, regardless of how merciful they're characterized to be. Korin getting mad at Kotaro and stating that's not how we do things anymore is also really hypocritical considering we are currently needlessly marching on Hoshido as this takes place. Kaze has a line at the end of this chapter about how nothing is black and white. This has come up a couple of other times in the story, and I can't help but find it extremely ironic considering how the rest of the game portrays the conflict between the two countries, to the point of actively shaming you for choosing conquest over birthright, and yes, this will come up later, and no, I'm still not over this. We end up in Izumo, which is a neutral country. This chapter is also pretty confusing, and let's go over why. The Hoshiden royal family is here too, and we are treated to a scene where Ryoma says he wants to talk to Korin and negotiate. Except that this doesn't happen because he and Xander both get into an argument about who's more attractive. Fucking why? The character started acting like responsible adults for a grand total of 5 seconds before immediately reverting back to stupidity. And I guess we just stopped here because it doesn't really require a detour anyways, but why did the Hoshiden royals even agree to come to a party in another country when there is an invasion looming overhead? This is also a recurring thing, but even though they react to Korin, absolutely none of them react to Azura despite being their adoptive sister. You know, the one that they actually grew up with. I am completely convinced at this point that they were all not nearly as accepting and kind to her as she would have us believe. I know some characters deny this, but I can't look at their interactions in the main story and see anything else, no matter how hard I try to. It turns out that the Hoshiden royal family was basically sent here as a trap. The leader of Izumo turns out to be Zola of the Norian army in disguise. The Hoshiden royals are captured by Zola, giving us a perfect opportunity to just kill them and end this war without killing any other innocents. Except that Korin doesn't do that because both they and Xander start complaining about how it's not honorable. It's like, I don't know, man, I think your current plan is even less honorable. Absolutely baffling to me that they have the opportunity to just end the game right there and willingly, knowingly choose not to take it. Now, maybe they somehow still thought they could win this war without taking lives. After all, they don't yet know that Garen will soon join to shit on everyone's umbrellas. But even then, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that a situation like this will literally always result in casualties. Korin may plan to spare everyone they come across, but Korin and their friends aren't the only ones in charge of the Norian army, and they don't even know if they'll be able to keep up sparing everyone they meet. I could maybe half expect this mindset from Korin considering how they're characterized as being naive, even if this still seems like something they should have grown out of at this point, but it makes even less sense for Xander, Camilla, and Leo, who had been exposed to actual battle long before Korin was even allowed to leave the fortress. They should all know that something like this just isn't possible. They don't even have to kill the Hoshiden royal family to accomplish this, just hold them hostage until the war is over instead of literally just letting them walk away so they can cause you trouble later. Ryoma says after the fight that he would have done the same for the Norians, even though we know with absolute certainty that this is not true because he was in that situation earlier and used it to try and kill a little girl. The following Thanksgiving family dinner is so awkward it makes me want to commit seppuku out of sheer unfiltered cringe. This is physically painful to watch. It's also very clearly just a way to guilt trip you for not buying Revelation by trying to tease you with some potentially friendly interaction between the two casts and then pulling the "if only things had turned out differently" nudge nudge wink wink. And then we commit genocide in the next chapter, and I wish I was joking about that. We walk into Kitsune territory where said Kitsune basically decide that we're a threat and we're forced into a battle. The party defeats them, except for some reason they decide they can't spare the Kitsune as they were apparently serious about killing us, as though every other enemy in every other map wasn't also explicitly dead serious about killing us. This is absolutely not a valid justification, as the Kitsune encounter isn't actually any different from every other battle we've been in, where we've evidently been able to spare everyone, at least for the most part. Saying that they were going to kill you isn't an explanation that makes any sense because of this. And having Azura talk about forgiving oneself and how they had no choice directly afterwards is kinda awful, because they clearly did have a choice. I don't even know what the logic or justification on the part of the writers was for having this in the game at all. It's never mentioned again, it isn't necessary for the plot, and just exists to be stupid and make you angry at the game, both in gameplay and in story. If you removed this chapter from the game, I'm pretty sure nobody would miss it, and that is a certified 100% Cosmic Cove guarantee. I'm pretty sure it was partially added because we killed the Wolfskins in Birthright, but it was somehow even worse there, we'll get to that at some point. And Fates' constant dedication to having both main routes mirror each other in every way is honestly a huge detriment, to the point it makes you think that the mirroring was less of an artistic choice and more so a choice done out of sheer time crunch. It makes each route feel a lot more predictable and samey because of how many story beats they share, and often results in really stupid shit like this. It's also probably the entire reason the invasion plotline exists, because you go into Nor during Birthright, so they felt like they needed to have an excuse for you to go to Hoshido during Conquest, but I've already told you why that sucks. The next chapter is where we fight the Wind Tribe because their leader Fuga wants to test Korin in battle because they are the Yato's wielder. I don't have too much to say about this chapter, it's just more of the same thing where people trust Korin purely because they have the Yato. And I get that the Wind Tribe is neutral, but you'd still think Fuga would take some kind of moral issue with Korin invading Hoshido. But nah, he doesn't really do anything about it. Again, because of the Yato. It's just another instance of the Yato being an almighty plot excuse and little else. And then we have the Eternal Stairway. Iago is shown here plotting to bring down Korin and then summoning Faceless to kill them. Why? Isn't Korin fighting on your side? It completely goes against your and Garen's plan. What's the purpose of just killing us for the lols when you literally benefit from our actions? I guess it might be because Garen is possessed and crazy, but Iago absolutely does not have that excuse. And this is why I dislike Iago and Hans, and I'm grouping them together since they're basically the same character anyway. They don't have any kind of motivation beyond follow Garen and be evil. They are yet another aspect of how much the game wants to obnoxiously shove in your face how bad Nor is. Yet another thing to throw any semblance of moral ambiguity into the garbage out back and then set it on fire. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion, but the story would quite honestly be better if these two characters just didn't exist. They serve no purpose beyond being Saturday morning cartoon villains and have no depth, potential, or believability. Which is not to say Saturday morning cartoon villains are inherently bad, but they are the polar opposite of what this story needed. There's a section at the end of chapter 22 where Garen and his two stooges come along to piss on everyone's parade and execute a bunch of prisoners. I've seen some people defend this part because it's telling Korin they chose the wrong side. Oh wow, that's so genius. But I hate it because of exactly that. It's the game telling you you chose the wrong side. Not just telling you, but telling you over and over repeatedly ad nauseum that you're wrong, with the protagonist about as hopelessly passive as the current US Democratic Party. It gets to a point where it merely feels like obnoxious edginess and tragedy for the sake of it. What's the purpose? Is it to tell you that the Norians are bad? I understood it the first 200 times, and it's not the last time something like this will happen. There's nothing to learn here, no lesson for Korin to take from this that hasn't already been established. If you're going to go through all of this effort to tell the player they chose the wrong game, what's the point of Conquest existing at all? There isn't one. The choice is completely fucking meaningless when one is so obviously the wrong one. I'm not playing Spec Ops The Line, this shit does not work here. And when the whole selling point was choosing a side, Fates as a whole begins to feel meaningless by how much its draw and premise is immediately compromised by this fact. The choice is an illusion and nothing more. More than that, it's honestly such a scummy decision to paint one of your routes as objectively wrong, to the point of shaming the player when you have to buy the routes separately. Because yeah, my favorite part of Conquest was clearly when Takumi reaches through the screen and shows up in your real house to point a Glock at your head so that you'll give him $20. It's trying so hard to get you to buy Birthright in particular that it made me hate Birthright on principle on my first playthrough, and then I just never got over that. Getting back to the story at hand, every royal character in the game has a chapter named after them, and it's always a chapter where you fight them, usually for the final time. There is exactly one exception to this. Well, okay, there's actually two, but you don't ever fight Elise in any route, so her lacking a chapter named after her makes sense. In contrast, Takumi is the royal you fight the most, yet his chapter isn't titled Takumi, but rather Possessed. This is obviously super inconsistent, but what really sucks about it is that it spoils the reveal for the chapter for absolutely no reason. Takumi snaps and completely breaks down after you beat him, and I know that it's intended to show how far he's fallen down the rabbit hole. This character that has gone through every effort to show you how much he hates you is reduced to a sobbing mess by the end of this chapter because of this perceived betrayal. But the execution of this idea still sucks. This was really the only time in all three routes I felt even a little bit bad for him. It's not hard to see that they're going for this tragic lens, but his behavior during the rest of the story is far too one-dimensionally antagonistic for this to work. Even before his apparent possession takes root and before the routes split off, he's only ever shown mistreating and abusing everyone around him, and so there's really no reason for the player to feel for him. And that's all leaving aside how possession is just a bad plot device. This scene could have been a lot better if they hadn't mishandled the characters so badly. Everything else I have to say about this scene I've already said elsewhere. Anankos forces Takumi to commit suicide, which only exists to absolve Korin of the possibility of having to do it themselves, and they are unable to find the body, which definitely won't come back to bite us in the ass later. On the bright side, at least we won't have to deal with Taco Boy's incessant yelling for the rest of the story. Anyway, the next chapter opens with Garen slaughtering civilians. We literally just went over this. The game is just actively mocking you at this point. We fight Hinoka and then convince her to run. Camilla flirts with her a bit, which is definitely out of place considering where we are in the plot right now. After this conversation, Hinoka says that Korin's dream is pure, even though we are currently invading the capital, so Hinoka has no reason to be praising Korin right now. I know this sounds like it goes against what I just said about how I dislike Conquest's general attitude towards the player, but I want to make it clear I don't want to be patted on the back for the awful shit we do either, because then you're just stroking Korin's ego solely because they're the protagonist. So what's the solution if I don't want to be congratulated for being the bad guy, but also don't want to be told how awful I am for not giving them an extra $20? Maybe, just maybe, you should just not make Noor, Garen, and his cronies stupidly evil in the first place. I know that's a crazy idea. Hilariously, this single scene I'm pretty sure has Korin and Hinoka engage in more actual conversation with each other than they do in the entirety of Birthright. We fight Ryoma in the next chapter, and honestly, Thorn in You is such an amazing track for this fight. After the fight, Ryoma decides he doesn't want to fall in the hands of the Norians and commit suicide. It does fall into the aforementioned issues where characters will just conveniently die so Korin doesn't have to do anything, but I think at the very least it's done a lot better here. Ryoma knows at this point that no matter what, he's toast. He's established as being very honor-driven and doesn't want to sully that honor by being executed, so he does it himself. It's a very fitting end for Ryoma as a character, and in this particular case I think it makes for a better and more dramatic scene than if he was executed by Korin or Garen or Iago. Soon after, we finally get the chance to take out Iago and Hans, but this isn't really satisfying in the way that it should be. These two should have been out of the picture around 10 chapters ago. It's just way too late for it to truly be gratifying. So late, in fact, that we are basically at the end of the game. There is no time given to appreciate it. All I'm left with is the frustration with how egregiously these two overstayed their welcome. And when it finally comes time to kill Iago, Korin isn't even the one who gets to do it, with Leo killing him instead. I don't understand what the point of that is. Usually, the reason something like this happens is to stop Korin from having to do something morally questionable directly. But Iago is a one-dimensional villain who exists purely for the purpose of being a hate sink. Nobody in your audience is going to think less of Korin for killing him. Once they're at the throne room, Korin comes clean about Garen and their intentions to have him sit on the throne. The Norian siblings are taken aback by this. I still just don't get why any of this was necessary, because the Norian siblings know that Garen is a bad dude. They've all been shown throughout the story disapproving of Garen's actions, only being reluctant to fight him because he's their father. Even Xander seems to know at this point and is just on copium. I find this genuinely interesting, but I can't help but feel that there were so many other better ways to present it. There's two things that Camilla and Xander say that stand out to me here. Camilla asks Korin why they didn't tell her. With this sentence, Camilla has just established herself as the only character with a working brain. Corrin had no reason to doubt the Norian siblings, even leaving behind the whole crystal ball incident. Well, except maybe one of them, which brings me to Xander's reaction. Xander says that if Corrin is lying, they will be killed like a traitor. This is wildly out of pocket and out of character. Xander has been shown throughout the rest of the game repeatedly sticking up for Corrin. The two of them are not just stated, but actually shown to be close with each other. I guess it's supposed to be the copium, but my god man, please choose any other fucking way to get that across to the audience. Again, I find this tension between the Norian royals and Garen to be genuinely interesting. I just wish it was handled with more grace. They walk into the throne room to find the Goo Man himself and are understandably a little upset. This is where the Siegfried joins with the Yato, and here's the thing. This is the only time where a legendary weapon actually coincides with the growth of a character, that of course being Xander finally standing up to Garen. The other ones just kinda seem to happen whenever the game decides the Yato's old stats aren't gonna cut it during the gameplay, and I really wish the rest of them were more like this one. It would give them a bit more importance than just being extra batteries to power your chainsaw. Anyway, this asshole shows up and is absolutely determined to ruin your day by giving you the worst final boss fight of all time. But before that, we realize he's fully gone, and Corrin, in the stupidest gambit imaginable, thinks that they can calm him down by letting him kill them. I don't know why you thought that would work. This results in Corrin having a vision of the afterlife and talking with Makoto, Ryoma, and finally Takumi himself in his non-possessed natural state. This scene has seemingly drawn a lot of ire from a lot of people, but I don't hate it entirely. The reasons most people hate it boil down to claiming it's character assassination for Takumi and that Corrin is absolved undeservingly. And I'm extremely mixed about this. It's a little hard for me to call this character assassination with a straight face when the entirety of Fates, but especially Conquest, is character assassination for Takumi. This doesn't really strike me as any better or worse than other scenes with him, it's just bad in a different way. Spirits of the dead in fiction, or in a lot of religions, when they aren't just some spooky ghost here to haunt people and curse your bloodline or whatever, tend to be portrayed as having moved on and made peace with any previous hang-ups they had in life. So obviously he's not gonna walk up to Corrin and slap them, as much as I'm sure some of you would love to see that. The line that people seem to take issue with is when he says, "I'm sorry for letting you slip away," which, if you take it from the Corrin getting absolved easily standpoint, makes sense as to why people don't like it, even if honestly the scene a few chapters before with Hinoka is about 100 times worse about this. But I think that this scene could work a little better in a different context, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record, where Nor isn't stupid evil. It would probably feel a lot less like Corrin is being a karma Houdini because their actions would be more justified in the first place. I know that Corrin doesn't have to reconcile with all of their siblings on the opposing side, and probably honestly shouldn't, but Corrin and Takumi have a unique relationship throughout Conquest. Takumi is, throughout the game, one of its most major antagonists. The whole route kind of builds up to this confrontation, and the connection between the two of them is one of its most vital aspects, more so than any of the other Hoshidan royals. And so the only way they are ever able to finally reconcile is in death, which is a really cool idea. It's a shame that it completely contradicts everything else in tone and general goal. Conquest can't seem to decide whether it wants the final boss to be Corrin thematically facing up to their mistakes or not. But if it is supposed to be that, then having this happen right before the fight is a terrible choice. There's some point during the scene where everyone in your party takes their turn saying their motivational line to Corrin, which is so cheesy it makes me physically cringe into oblivion. Not to mention, it's really weird that everybody is talking to Corrin like they refuse to believe they're dead. They don't do this with any other death in the game and can clearly see that Corrin is dead. Lilith shows up alongside your family for no reason. I know that she's secretly Corrin's sister, but in all three routes, Corrin doesn't know this and the player doesn't know this. So Lilith being here just comes out of absolutely nowhere. It's after this that Corrin wakes up and uses the Fujin Yumi to repair the Yato. Why does it revive Corrin? Is there a logical reason this happens? Is it because of the Fujin Yumi? If the legendary weapons can bring people back from the brink, then every death in this game up to this point has been utterly pointless. I like the idea of Takumi as a final boss. Even if it is a cliche, having your final obstacle be someone sentimentally important to the protagonist is a lot more memorable and interesting than generic evil dragon number 23. The issue, though, is that he's still possessed by generic evil dragon number 23. He has no agency here, and so we are essentially just fighting Anonkos but with bad hair, so it loses most of its effectiveness. We kill him and he disappears into water, rest in piss. And then Azura pieces out without anyone noticing. In Birthright, she had this dramatic death scene. How did nobody here notice her lying on the floor while dying? That seems like an extremely difficult thing to just not see. It also just kinda comes across as the writing giving the middle finger to the player one last time. What's the purpose of having her die off screen even though she is in the same room as everyone else while it's happening? Is there any particular reason you didn't say something like, hey, I think I'm dying? Are you that afraid of inconveniencing people? I mean, that's kind of relatable if I'm being honest. It seems like the pipeline of Azura dying off screen, even though this doesn't make any sense in Conquest, to Azura dying on screen in Birthright, to Azura living through Revelation, is supposed to imply some kind of intended order for the different routes. Something I will definitely be talking about more later. And now for the epilogue. I can't help but feel the ending has quite the mood shift, being all happy and having everyone celebrating, even despite everything that's happened throughout the story. There's a bit of a tonal dissonance with that. It seems like the ending to a story like this would fit being more somber than outright happy. My last complaint is that they apparently are planning on going to Hinoka's coronation. Holy shit, we are getting assassinated if we go there. Also, Xander just telling the player directly that war is bad assumes I'm dumb and can't read between the lines for the very obvious message in the last chapters. He literally looks directly into the camera to tell you this like he's on TV, trying to tell the kids only you can prevent forest fires. Also, Corrin crashes into Camilla's tits. What the fuck was that about? I think a huge source of frustration with Conquest can be summed up as just, what the hell is Fate trying to do? What kind of incomprehensible Cthulhu god alien logic was being exchanged at the writing table? What was the goal? You have huge swaths of the game telling you what an irredeemable piece of shit you are, but then occasionally sprinkling in towards the end, oh, it was fine actually. Which is it supposed to be? It's like it wants to commit to this being a villain route, but chickens out at the end. But in its chickening out, it still fails to give Nor or Corrin any kind of justification reason. I have a very hard time believing that no one on the writing team looked at this and realized how horrible this looks, because it's just so explicit about it that it's past the point of any plausible deniability. I think it's a lot more likely that they knew and either didn't care or didn't have the time to change it. I guess it's not shocking that time crunch is going to lead to things falling off a cliff, and we do already know that this game had a troubled development cycle, but perhaps it doesn't really matter what the writers were trying to do so much as it matters what they accomplished regardless. And because what they accomplished was a villain route, everything begins to fall apart. Some people like doing evil things for fun in games, but in my experience, it's rarely for the purpose of getting invested in a story. If I boot up Minecraft, go to a village, give myself a netherite sword from the creative menu and kill all the villagers while setting their homes on fire, I'm not doing that to get invested in some narrative I've created in my head. I'm doing it because I thought it would be funny. I hope I've made it abundantly clear as to why Fates needs a certain amount of ambiguity to work. I don't think it's a crazy leap to say that having a surprise villain route does not work in a game where you buy each route before you even get to know the characters. And the thing is, I think I'd be significantly more okay with it if Birthright and Revelation were also treated this way and Corrin was just always a morally questionable person. But as it is, there is essentially a pecking order as to which routes are more correct. Corrin even says outright in chapter 15 that siding with Nor was a mistake, with the rest of Conquest doing everything it can to support this when nothing even close to this happens in Birthright or Revelation. It's not just the moral aspect that reinforces this either, with even things like Azura's fate in each route being symptomatic of this. She doesn't get the dignity of dying on screen because the game just fucking hates you. To be clear, having a game where you're playing as the villain isn't always inherently bad. And additionally, not every story has to make you feel comfortable. Guilt is also a perfectly valid emotion for fiction to shoot for. Typically, when a story is aiming for this, there's some kind of reason for it, usually to hammer home some kind of message, otherwise it's just making you feel like garbage for no reason. Conquest tries to dress up this reasoning as some kind of anti-war message, but the context makes it clear how shallow this approach is. When I think of better games that make you feel guilt and are anti-war, I think of games like Spec Ops: The Line. And I know that this example will come across as really cringy, but bear with me. When Spec Ops: The Line released, it killed its own series because the development team knew that they could never make another game in its series again. And how could they? It was a criticism of its very genre. To go back would be hypocritical. It wasn't done because they thought it would sell more copies. It was done because they felt a genuine passion for their message. Contrasting this, Conquest's anti-war theme wasn't done because they truly cared about this subject. It was done because it would sell more routes. It would end Conquest's story in a way that was more unsatisfying than the other routes, emotionally coercing the player into buying Birthright or Revelation when Conquest already cost the whole fucking $40 like every other fully priced 3DS game. It all comes across like a smokescreen, a party trick, rather than something the writers actually gave a fuck about portraying respectfully. I shouldn't have to be describing your writing as cynical, but when you use your themes in such an uncaring way, what else could it possibly be? And it's not like this is a theme that exists in the game entirely separate from the fact that the game generates money, because it plays directly into it. And hell, you could make the argument for capitalism ruining this game even without this, because the game was obviously rushed to meet deadlines, which I guess just applies to most AAA games nowadays, but still, even if, by some small chance, this is all a coincidence, this is still what it does in practice. What this is, in essence, is really bad DLC. Now, I'm not just an old crusty Facebook boomer. I don't hate DLC, okay? DLC has its place. But there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. It shouldn't feel like you're kneecapping the base game for the sake of selling DLC. It's supposed to be an extra thing, not a literal requirement. It's why I don't have a problem with Heirs of Fate or any of the miscellaneous DLC packs, for example, because it's not supposed to be a part of the base experience. It's just a fun bonus. But Conquest and Birthright are both together the core of the experience, Revelation being slightly less so in my opinion. And to be fair, you could also say the same thing in reverse for Birthright being the least preferred because of its gameplay being the easiest. But that doesn't really make it any better. It makes it worse because both of them are being held back in some way. It's not something I'll really be focusing on since gameplay just isn't the focus of this video, but it is incredibly funny that they tried to pass Birthright off as a game for newcomers just because it's easy, when Fire Emblem has this crazy new thing called difficulty options. And yet, somehow, despite all of this, I actually think Conquest has the best story of the three, which I think just goes to show how low the other two will dip in quality considering how much I just complained about it. The closely knit relationship between Corrin and their found family, the tension between all of them and their shitty, awful father. The internal conflict that comes with knowing that you'll have to stoop low to save the people you love, who may end up hating you anyway. Corrin wanting to save someone who, in part due to Corrin's own actions, is already too far gone. These are all cool ideas that in most cases were simply not done their proper justice. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely the most abrasive of the three, and not in a good way. I'd be lying if I said that some of these scenes didn't feel like straight up cognito-hazards. But it actually tried a little bit to be something new, something more daring, and as such has a dramatic flair that Birthright and Revelation lack entirely. I think Conquest comes the closest to being a proper story, and in any hypothetical rewrite, it would be the one you'd have to make the least amount of changes to. It actually holds some loyalty to that original theme that the route split presented of found family versus blood family. It has a structure, it has some good characters and interesting things going on. Yeah, I know, groundbreaking, right? The only other stories that do this are most of them. The foundation is there, and is at least in theory much more robust and complete than the other two. It's just that everything around it is weird and smelly. I think Conquest really is the best representation of why people feel so strongly about Fates. Conquest especially was clearly quite ambitious at some point, the most ambitious of the three routes. But it fails completely. It's being pulled in so many different directions that it just crumbles under the weight of it. But it's because it so clearly at some point in time wanted to be something more than it is that I can't help but want that too. It is perhaps partially because I am a bit of a contrarian at heart that I've become a little less harsh on Conquest than I was before. But even with all that said, I really don't blame people for holding the grudge that they do against it. On the bright side, since Conquest is the route most laced in controversy for most people, I feel I can relax a little going into Birthright. At the very least, this section isn't going to be as bad to edit because I don't have to trudge through as much footage that feels like it should be locked behind an underground safe for radioactivity like a fucking SCP. But despite that, don't be fooled by what people say. This one is the worst. People try to say often that Birthright is just boring, but dismissing its issues this way is akin to saying losing your wife and kids is a little bit of an inconvenience. It's just that Birthright is a little more deceptive about its nastier qualities. I already went over a large part of why in my previous videos, namely I explained why the characters and the setting were just inherently worse. The TLDR is that Hoshido has a cast of what comes across as entirely cardboard nepo babies who live near perfect lives under what may as well be the Teletubby babyface sun. But of course, the general cast being dog shit wouldn't matter as much if the royals were good. But they aren't. They're infinitely worse than the Norian royals, and the Norian royals had Camilla. Ryoma and Takumi both try to kill Elise on 2 separate occasions for no reason other than because Lamau. Ryoma is a massive hypocrite and liar, and Takumi's genuinely abusive treatment of the people around him makes me want to be sick in my mouth. I'm not going to look through the dialogue again to confirm this, because I'm not exaggerating when I say that some of the shit he says and gets excused for is genuinely upsetting to me, but I am almost entirely certain that he implies he tried to get Azura exiled, in other words, kidnapped, like several fucking times prior to the events of the story in his battle dialogue in chapter 10. The next person I see who tries to make this dude into a tragic booby is getting hit with a fucking mallet. Sakura and Hinoka never matter and are entirely characterized as being sidekicks. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Hoshidan princesses in particular never get any kind of spotlight, because why treat your female characters like 3-dimensional human beings when you can make them background scenery? The almost complete irrelevance of the female characters feels especially noticeable in this route, probably in part because Hinoka isn't really there to fill any meaningful role, and because of the way Azura gets handled, and because what little plot Birthright has revolves around finding the princes, which means that the only things Sakura and Hinoka offer are stray lines of filler dialogue, and anything semi-important is left to Takumi and Ryoma. I'm not going to sugarcoat the Conquest cast. It has Camilla the sex offender, Niles the sex offender, and Soleil the sex offender. There's a lot of sex offenders in this game, but there were also some genuinely decent, likable characters thrown in there, like Laszlo or Elise or Leo. The only Birthright exclusive Hoshidan character I found myself enjoying was Reina, who has one support chain and never matters. I'd rather take a cast that's a mixed bag with some good than one that consistently ranges only from mediocre to terrible. In fact, none of the characters in Birthright ever really do anything of consequence. Without even having to go into the events of the story, the foundation, your main cast and setting, is already built on absolutely nothing. Something that a lot of people might disagree with me on is the fact that Birthright is, to me, what Revelation is to most people. I'm not going into it too much yet, but a major reason people dislike Revelation is because Fate spends time trying to tease you with some potential golden route that it portrays as objectively correct, only to say, hey, you gotta pay extra for that. And since I played Conquest first, I think it's extremely obvious as to why this applies to Birthright being teased, read, forced in Conquest 2. And not only does it apply to Birthright, Birthright is in fact so much worse about it. And you might try to say, well, why not blame Conquest for most of this? But people hate Revelation for things technically outside of it. Framing and context is crucial, and even if they are things that exist outside of Birthright itself by nature of it being, well, context, it isn't any less a part of it. The thing with Revelation is that it just shouldn't exist, because yes, if you play it, it invalidates everything else. And yes, it isn't even remotely close to following what made this game look appealing before it was actually released. And yes, its existence is unnecessary. But strangely enough, it's because it shouldn't exist that the fact that it doesn't mean much to me. This, much like everything else I've said, is obviously highly subjective and just a matter of perspective, but for me personally, it was far more important that they get Birthright and Conquest correct than Revelation, because Revelation existing is superfluous. So Birthright being this way is so much more inexcusable to me. The double standard involved is so bad. The country that the writers actually wanted you to favor could not be more obvious if they tried. Just because Birthright is depicted as the hero route doesn't mean it doesn't have its fair share of hypocritical bullshit, and honestly, that just makes it worse because you get the impression that the game wants you to think everything you do in Birthright is entirely right and justified. As a result, the game oozes this asinine sense of self-righteousness. Another major blockade Birthright faces is its themes, which don't exist. The original theme that the game presents is, do you choose your blood or the bonds that you've forged? This is another way in which Birthright is just doomed from its very foundation, because this means that this route's theme is that blood, your genetic code, is more important than lived experiences, which is kind of messed up. God forbid someone be adopted, I guess? You could go a little further with this and say that this is supported by the world building, wherein Hoshido chooses retainers based on bloodline, or the fact that your party members are all a part of those bloodlines. Or hey, if you want to get really surface level, you could even say that this is supported by the name of the route itself. And to be entirely fair, you could absolutely make the argument that this isn't the intended theme for Birthright. And when you really consider it, it kind of can't be, because it later turns out you're not related to the Hoshidan royal family. You might try to say then that Birthright shares its theme with Conquest, Found Family, and this would fix the issue where Fates doesn't have much of a binding theme to tie everything together, but in practice, this never matters. You could have Corrin be a random guy with no perceived connection to the Hoshidan royals and everything would be the exact same. You also don't find out that you're not related to them in Birthright itself unless you make some particularly bad romantic choices, so this can't be it either. A lot of people like to say because of all of this that the intended theme is something along the lines of loyalty versus morality. Do you follow along with the people you're closest to, or do you choose to do the right thing despite it? But my issue with this interpretation is thus. First of all, this is a message that essentially boils down to you should do the right thing sometimes being stretched out into a 20-hour game. It's unbelievably boring. Like, yeah, I guess you probably should be a good person, but this is a theme so simple it doesn't justify the screen time. And it's not like it's explored in any way beyond the base conflict of the game. It's not any more interesting in practice. This is also just straight up not at all how the game frames Corrin's decision to join Hoshido. It's not presented under the argument that Garen is evil and killed your mom, or that you should do this purely because it's the right thing to do, as this only comes up in the Branch of Fate scene after Corrin chooses Conquest. It is instead under the false pretense that this is Corrin's real family. So basically, there's not a whole lot of good ways to interpret the events of Birthright. And even after mulling over it for way too long, there are in fact no ways to interpret Birthright's themes that actually hold up to scrutiny as still making sense and being supported by the game. Like, sure, I guess you don't have to have a theme, you don't have to do anything when writing a story other than simply write what you want. But a good story will still have new, interesting interpretations emerge regardless of the author's intent. But here, it is quite literally impossible to do that because everything is so outstandingly shallow. Birthright itself is entirely pointless. Ryoma tries to get you to join him on a lie. You aren't related to them, you didn't know them your whole life, you are literally just a guy who showed up. Its own premise cannibalizes itself. I should probably move on before too long and get to the events of the story itself. The actual plot starts when we head to Forginia, where we are attacked by the Norians. They are absolutely certain to point out how this is an unarmed hospital, because remember, Nor is never allowed to do anything rational or decent. We meet Silas, and it's established that although Corrin was close childhood friends with him, Corrin has amnesia and can't remember him. Do they ever explain this? No, they don't. I assume it's supposed to be a side effect of Garen brainwashing Corrin as a child, but firstly, Corrin met Silas after they'd already been taken to Nor, and second, didn't we already solve Corrin's amnesia? It could have served as a bit of an early glimpse into the main emotional core of Fates, being that you'll have to fight people you care about, but that opportunity is lost when you only have Corrin remember after the fight. It also makes the relationship between Corrin and Silas generally feel so much weaker and less grounded in reality, and makes the scene feel oddly comical in a way I don't think it was supposed to. It's established at around this time that Takumi and Ryoma went missing at some point recently, so I'm assuming there was some kind of small time skip, but it's never stated how long it's actually been. It just feels really off-putting starting out Birthright with a time skip of all things, especially when, as far as I can remember, the other routes do no such thing. Shortly afterwards, we have a brief cutscene fight at the Eternal Stairway against some Faceless wearing Fates, in another exercise in the complete erasure of any subtlety or nuance, establishes that the Faceless are actually innocent people put under spells by Norian mages. Thank you, Fates, for screaming into my ear for the 752nd time about how evil the Norians are. Regardless of that, though, there's a brief span of time after this where nothing of note really happens until we hit chapter 10, where we come across Takumi's recruitment. I'm sure that based on my clearly very positive opinions on this character. I will have some very positive opinions on this scene. Essentially, Anonkos was able to possess Takumi, same thing as in Conquest. Except, because this same chain of events happens in Conquest for Anonkos to begin taking control of Takumi, and Azura has been captured in that route and therefore isn't able to sing to bring him back to normal, and he's supposed to be more mentally stable in Birthright, this implies by all logic that either Anonkos should have completely taken control of him by the second time you fight him in Conquest, or it should have happened far later in the story in Birthright. Why is it that in Conquest it's portrayed as this slow process that takes until you fight him at the Great Wall of Susano, but in Birthright it's immediate? Azura brings him back to normal by singing to him and then complimenting him, and this makes sense in universe. But from a perspective of the writing, considering Takumi's established previous treatment of Azura, having her be the one responsible for bringing him back every time and then stroking his ego feels very gross to me. And then he immediately accepts Azura as his sister and is super friendly to her out of literally nowhere, even though the last time we saw him he was telling off Azura for existing next to him. This flip in attitude is so jarring and sudden and has literally no logic to it whatsoever. It was probably only done just so that the player didn't realize that they would want to beat this guy with a stick until Candy comes out. So, of course, instead of making the character more believable and sympathetic in general, or setting up any kind of actual character development, they have him turn into a different person within the span of 5 seconds. Moving on to chapter 11, we get attacked by some very spooky ghosts, and what you may begin to notice is that there will be long stretches of time within the story where absolutely nothing important happens. There's no real goal other than just defeating Garen at the end of the game, and so the plot is completely structureless. The plot for each individual chapter typically boils down to, and then they got attacked on their way to go kill Garen. You'd think they would use this time to flesh out characters and character relationships, especially among the Hoshiden royals and Korin. But no. We can all snicker as much as we like about Camilla being a little too family-friendly, but with that exception, the Conquest Royals actually convincingly felt like a tightly knit family unit who had each other's backs, who had a past together. This, in turn, becomes Nor's greatest appeal. I cannot say the same for the Hoshiden Royals. Their relationship feels so surface level, you're given no hint as to how they interact except for to the most basic extent possible. All they ever minimally discuss is what's happening right now in the story. The whole premise of the game was coinciding with the siblings they were separated from at birth, but like I said, Korin could be a random dude and practically none of the interactions between the characters would be at all different. Something about all of the interactions in Birthright are so limp, so lifeless. Sometimes they'll talk about how glad they are to see each other, but it feels distant nonetheless. I can't place a finger on entirely why, it just sucks. You might try to say that this is because they don't share a past together, and so this makes sense, but this is precisely why it's so much more important in this route to spend time on this. Because Korin and the rest of the royals don't have a shared backstory to base it on, you need to put more effort into developing them now. You'd think Korin would be more curious about what their lives had been like, and they are in some supports, but I don't need to explain why hiding your entire premise behind side content is shitty. Birthright throws its premise into the trash, forgets what it is, and becomes nothing at all. You almost get the vibe that Korin is an outsider to their own family. I guess that makes sense, but it's never talked about. And the fact that it's never brought up convinces me that this wasn't an intentional thing so much as it's just bad writing. And it only adds grave insult to injury, that not only can you support with them just like you can with their Norian equivalent, you learn upon doing so that there was no fucking point to any of this and the game lied to you. It doesn't help that even Korin's Norian siblings have very little presence throughout Birthright compared to the Hoshiden siblings in Conquest. It was a huge deal in Conquest. They were constantly showing up and were super involved in the story. They're your main antagonists and they're gonna make sure you actually remember that. But the Norian siblings just do so little in Birthright. That's not to say that they aren't ever important or have no presence at all, because they certainly do, but they're definitely scaled back here more than they should be. What little happens in Birthright feels directionless and unearned. Encounters that have no purpose just sort of happen to pad out the hours, and while a lot of Fates has a tendency to make a chapter-wide plot out of getting jumped, it happens in Birthright the most. Even disregarding the fact that the majority of chapters in this route have a story that consists entirely of Detroit Simulator and very little else, its attempts at a B-plot are pathetically scaled back. While many of Conquest's plot points stick out in a bad way, many of Birthright's secondary goals barely register as secondary goals. You initially set out with the intent to find Takumi and Ryoma, and later on it introduces the traitor subplot, but these all just kind of feel like they're happening in the background despite one of these being the initial kickoff point. It's easy to tune out and forget most of what's happening because none of this tries to make any kind of impression, and you go away from it with the sense that you spent the whole game going from point A to point B doing fuck all. Anyway, we go to Circensia, and after the fight, Azura collapses due to using her song, but doesn't want to explain why. I get that it's a bit of a trope in Japanese media for characters to say it's nothing when it is very obviously something. I'll admit that even some of my favorite games of all time are a little bit guilty of this, but that doesn't really make it any less annoying when it gets overused like this. And nearly every time something important happens that Azura knows about, she'll try to tell you it's nothing. In universe, I understand why, at least in most cases. She doesn't want anyone to stop her from using her powers when they're pretty obviously going to be necessary. But she spent the entire game to the player being frustratingly cryptic. The problem with making a character the it's nothing trope personified, and even going so far as to lock her entire character behind a convenient curse, is that to us, she isn't mysterious or cool or intriguing or tragic, she's boring. But the writing is so clearly trying to go for this that it's just kind of laughable. Even when you find out what's going on, it doesn't really invoke any kind of response because she spent the whole game not really having a personality or emotions. After we escape Circensia, we kind of just stumble our way into Chive after this and accidentally aid in their rebellion. I was under the impression before I played Birthright that aiding Chive would be a much bigger part of the story. We lead a very small force after all, so it makes sense that a big part of it would be getting a potential ally to trust us so they can aid us when we take down Garen. But when I say we stumble into Chive, I mean that we quite literally stumble in on accident and resolve it within a single chapter. We just walk in on cue like it's a fucking sitcom, go, gee, why is there a conflict here? End the conflict, and then learn you conveniently helped the resistance unintentionally. It's not something that our characters even knew about beforehand, and it's not something that's ever relevant after this point. This is really a shining example as to why nothing ever mattering in Birthright is a problem. You want to have a whole subplot involving helping out a potential ally that will have lasting effects and that will span more than 5 minutes of cutscenes? You want war politics in your war game? Go fuck yourself, kid. Here's a filler episode in a Wyvern Night that won't matter within the hour as a souvenir. Helping out Chive may as well have just not happened. You could have instead found Ryoma in a bush and the story would be the same. A few chapters later, after we've crossed into Nor, we encounter the Wolfskins and end up killing Keaton and the rest of the Wolfskin tribe. Nobody really thinks much of it, which is a very obvious double standard when you compare it to Conquest. In Conquest, we kill the Kitsune and it is rightly considered a tragedy and something horrible. Here, we do the exact same thing to the Wolfskins, and for some reason, it's barely addressed at all. Towards the end of the chapter, there is a landslide that happens for no discernible reason whatsoever, and if Corrin didn't have an A support with Kaze, he sacrifices himself to save Corrin. First of all, Corrin has a dragon form which has wings, and therefore I assume can fly, making this entire sacrifice completely unnecessary. It's not relevant to anything, it's just a death for the sake of shocking people that gets completely forgotten about after this chapter and never brought up again. This is also early enough in the story that it's extremely unlikely you have an A support with him unless you were actively trying for it, and there's no hint anywhere that you even need an A support. You'd need to already be familiar with the game or have someone tell you about it to take the steps to stop it from happening. In every discussion online, people always forget the incident with the Wolfskins exists, but not for the typical reason where it's simply because it's forgettable. Two very stupid things happen one after the other, and the only one that people remember enough to criticize is Kaze's death. And it's hard after a certain point not to feel like this was by design. After the map is over, Corrin has a couple short lines that honestly are so minimal they feel like they're only obligatory on the part of the writers about how awful this was, and Kaze immediately starts talking about something else. The only way you can get the game to talk about it at all is if you go out of your way to save Kaze, which is extremely unlikely on your first playthrough. Even though Corrin and Ryoma have a scene here that's actually pretty good in a vacuum, which I know is unheard of for Birthright, it is so infected by the context that surrounds it that it is impossible to appreciate. There is nothing that makes what happens to the Kitsune in Conquest and what happens to the Wolfskins in Birthright morally different to each other, and yet the way that each route treats it is obviously different. And this is not to say that Conquest's way of dealing with it was good, because it wasn't. It was fucking terrible. But Conquest ends the chapter this way, and in doing so, forces you to think about it, whether that was the intent or not. It actually tries to talk about it and doesn't try to shy away from the fact that it happened. But Birthright, in a display of cowardice, tries to distract you instead. Kaze's death is only there so that they don't have to talk about what just happened to the Wolfskins. The Wolfskins aren't even associated with Garen at all, they're innocent in the same way the Kitsune are. But by killing off Kaze like this, at this exact point in the story, you use it as a decoy so players will focus on that, and not the fact that you just committed genocide against an entire tribe of people, as well as being a convenient excuse to not have the characters talk about it either. But if you're going to do everything you can to hide the fact that it happened, why is it in the game? One of Corrin's only lines about it is them saying that we should never forget about what happened here. Not only does the game make it look like everyone then immediately forgot about what happened here because nobody mentions it ever again, it is getting you, the player, to forget about what happened here. Not only is this not any better, it is actively so much worse because the game seems to imply with this that it was no big deal. This is the most blatant display of one-sidedness in the game and has the miserable dishonor of being my least favorite chapter in all of Fates. No guys, it's not important when we kill the innocents. I just can't shake how gross it feels. This shit haunts my dreams, and it haunts me even more that it worked on people because people are so eager to talk about the Kitsune, but not this. Chapter 16 rolls around and Takumi gets sick after being in contact with the Wolfskins. Leaving aside that it's kind of awful that the game wants to portray a tribe of people you just killed as carrying diseases, what the fuck? We have to go to Palace Makarath to get him the medicine, and this is sounding a little familiar. Yeah, so for some reason, Birthright and Conquest just steal a chapter from each other. It predictably has all of the equivalent chapters' same issues. It's still far too separate from the rest of the story, it's still weird filler that never becomes important again, and it feels stale due to the two routes just straight up copying each other's homework. The previous part where we fought the Wolfskins also has this issue, it just feels way too similar to the Kitsune chapter in Conquest. The following chapter has us visit the Ice Tribe where we get lured into a trap led by Flora because Garen essentially threatened to kill everyone in the village. What I don't get is the scene that happens at the end of the chapter. Flora feels so regretful of her actions that she immolates herself right then and there. This is after our party has reassured her that we forgive her and that it wasn't her fault. Being set on fire in real life is widely considered to be one of the most slow and painful ways to go, and yet she just stands there completely calm and even converses with the party as she dies. If this happened to a real person, they would be screaming in pain the whole way through. This death also has no effect on the story, and much like Kaze's death, just seems to exist for shock value. It was also directly in front of her sister, by the way. No amount of therapy will ever fix that. Why is it that almost every twist in this game just boils down to, and then they suddenly died? These deaths are also clearly shoehorned in for the sake of trying to make the player feel something or trying to distract them, instead of ever adding anything of value. And since Kilma and Flora are both dead, logically Felicia would take over, except she doesn't do this in any of her endings, and it's never explained why or who takes over in her place. The writing team just straight up forgot about the Ice Tribe. In both Conquest and Revelation, we have a segment where something very similar happens, but Flora never sets herself on fire and is perfectly fine. There's no reason why she would do this unless the writers wanted to portray betraying Corrin after siding with Hoshido to be magically worse than any other alternatives, which would certainly fit in with the trend we've established. It's already portrayed the death of the Wolfskins as being no biggie and literally states they carry diseases, so of course this dogshit game would think betraying any associates of Hoshido to be a far graver sin. It just keeps leaning into this purity Sue act, where the party will always be absolutely correct in everything, and anyone and anything that might possibly go against that is ignored, buried, or punished. finished. But it will, of course, show the party forgiving everyone because they're so pure and incorruptible. Leaving that aside, the next chapter at least has a little more meat to it. We get to see Leo, and although I'm happy to see him, he's not very happy to see us, and we fight him in possibly one of the most lackluster maps in the game. And considering this is Birthright, that's kind of saying something. He's said before how much he always hated us, but it's only now that we get to peel back the curtain a little more. This arc, much like every other arc in Birthright, doesn't really stand out to me all too much. Everyone loves Corrin, so this doesn't mean anything. I do think it makes more sense here than, for example, the Hoshidan royals during Conquest, if only because Leo and Corrin actually grew up together. It holds some small similarities to Takami's arc in Conquest, being that they both go through every effort to appear as spiny as possible to Corrin to hide how hurt they are, but the more subdued approach in characterization actually makes it work here. This rare bright spot couldn't last any longer though, because they end off the chapter with another gaping plot hole. First of all, the crystal ball makes another guest star appearance. Do you think Azura just keeps like 6 of them in her pocket at all times? Afterwards, Leo gives us a book that will teleport us to and from our next destination. This opens an absolutely giant can of worms. Why do you just conveniently have this on you for no reason? Are you normally able to access books that can teleport you distances that large? Why are they not used anywhere else? Why can't we get more of them? And as a side note, since we fought Odin here, why doesn't the Awakening Trio try to help you in Birthright? They know the whole plot and were sent here for the sole purpose of helping Corrin kill Anonkos. Shouldn't they just have been route neutral characters like Silas or Kaze? But anyway, now we have to take a commercial break to power up the Yato. Something I always found strange was the list of people who had previously completed the Rainbow Sage's trial. Sumeragi, Xander, Garen, and another unknown person. Unless I'm stupid, they never hint at who this other person is. This is such a strange detail to emphasize since it's never brought up again after this. Granted, they also do this in Conquest and probably Revelation, I can't remember and I'm too lazy to check, so this isn't at all unique to this route. We complete the trial and the Rainbow Sage tells us that the real power was the friends we made along the way, so this entire road trip was pointless. And then he goes lol, just kidding, and the Fujin Yumi fuses with the Yato, so I guess not, what was the point of that? This is all super disconnected from everything else going on in the story. It doesn't help this that we have to teleport all the way across the map and back instead of it just being close by, especially considering the rest of the game, in contrast, has been one continuous route to the Norian capital. You could put this anywhere else in the story chronologically, and it would make just as much sense. The next chapter is mostly just filler, with Iago coming to try and get us vored by a dead dragon, with the main thing of note happening being Azura finally actually explaining that yes, her song will probably kill her. I will actually give this, like, the bare minimum credit. They do dedicate some time to establish this to get you a little bit invested in whether Azura is actually going to live through this, unlike Conquest, which just forgets and has her disappear with literally no explanation at all. But it just doesn't do a whole lot because Azura is still just not a particularly motivating character. She still lacks agency and ends up being the assigned vessel for bad things to happen to and little else. This doesn't change that, it honestly even exacerbates that issue. I think this goes to show that because the characters in Birthright are so unengaging and one note, nothing that happens to them has any punch or makes me feel anything beyond making me go, oh, okay, every time anything happens to them. Nothing in Birthright has any teeth or impact, which is part of what leads to this type of storytelling where things just kind of happen meanderingly without purpose. And yeah, Birthright's story lacking teeth isn't shocking when you spend zero time exploring the characters or their relationships. And Chapter 21 does give us at least a little bit of a sense of urgency by explaining that Hoshido is currently losing the war by a very wide margin, but it's far too little and too late. None of this same urgency has been present for the rest of the game, and even here, it's only mentioned briefly and then never again. And then we find a secret passage into the castle in the middle of a volcanic wasteland that is just here for some reason. Because convenience. Because convenience is an excuse that shows up in every Fates route, but Birthright definitely does it the most. It does everything it can to be one straight shot to the Norian castle, and will always make sure that the protagonists meet as little resistance as possible. Which is is why shit like the teleportation book or a random secret passage leading into the castle exists. And because they didn't want the precious pure birthright cast to storm the front gates and be faced with the possibility of endangering civilians, even though that's what happened in Conquest, proving to me once again that Fates just wants to suck your ego dick for playing Birthright. Just a little later, we find out Nor is starving, and the fact that Ryoma, the most powerful person in Hoshido, a country that is currently at war with Nor, did not know the first thing about how things are actually going in Nor is completely nonsensical and just exists to excuse him from any potential blame the audience might put on him. Because remember, the Birthright cast is never allowed to do any wrong. It's especially unbelievable considering Hoshido supposedly has very skilled spies to give intel about Nor. Do you expect me to believe that, conveniently, nobody took a single fucking look at how Norians lived and noticed this? It goes to show how obsessive this game is with keeping Hoshido's hands perfectly squeaky clean at all times, and this is only reinforced when Ryoma goes, well, why don't we just share, like this never fucking occurred to anyone ever before. Also, later when they see the underground markets, he literally says, oh, this looks like Hoshido other than the poverty, which is such an astonishingly dickish line for, like, no reason. We finally get to meet up with Elise and fight Camilla. I could comment next on how Camilla has gone into a mental shutdown since our last meeting, becoming extremely depressed and then trying to deny reality, and how it gives her a bit more of an interesting dimension to her character. But honestly, at this point I am so fatigued by this nothing burger of a story I'd like to skip ahead a little. Lilith dies and it's just as cheap, stupid, and comically melodramatic with no build-up as it was in Conquest, as she has had not a single line of dialogue in this route up until this point. Elise and Sakura attempt to heal her, which, if healing was on the table during the story the whole time, why could we not have used it like 20 different times by now? If you're going to have healing available in the cutscenes, this really seems like something you should kind of always have to consider. Otherwise, it's best to not broach this possibility at all if you're not going to go all the way. I will say a single nice thing about this scene, and it is that the snow effect looks nice. Chapter 25 is supposed to resolve the whole traitor subplot and complete Takami's character arc. And yeah, learning that the traitor was just a mind-controlled Takami the whole time was really underwhelming. I've already been over this. Mind control just sucks balls as a plot device. The game tries to act as though it's actually different and special, because it wouldn't work if Takami didn't secretly hold on to some small amount of resentment. But it isn't. I think a big part of why this left me feeling a little deflated is in how absolutely whack the cutscene itself is. Iago mind controls him and tells everyone about how insecure Pineapple Boy is. Takami tries to kill Azura, who is apparently just the game's designated punching bag at this point. Sakura tries to stop Iago, so there are actual physical things going on in this cutscene, but you don't get to see any of them because it just stays on the still image of Takami pinning Azura's hands behind her back for an uncomfortably long amount of time while making this dumb fucking face like he's a zombie from a D-list movie. I've mentioned this before a lot, I know, I'm sorry, but Azura's treatment by the game is kind of grimy and uncomfortable. She is, like I said, the game's designated punching bag. Everyone forgets she exists, despite being the main protagonist's right-hand woman. She dies in most routes, many of the characters treat her as though she is barely human, and constantly seems to be a target for misfortune. And yet, she is never allowed any kind of anger or grief. Here, we see Fates focus on Takami's struggles and let him be upset about things, but whenever Azura is shown nearly dying or getting attacked, here by a possessed Takami, she is just expected to suck it up and deal with it. Her characterization goes so far into being as stoic as possible that it comes across as though Fates doesn't actually want you to truly empathize with her. It wants you to feel sad for her on a surface level, but never truly view her as a person. As such, things like the subplot about her slow death have an almost voyeuristic undertone to them. It reminds me a little too much of how Shadows of Valentia will treat every woman in the story as a helpless victim that needs to be saved, and it doesn't help that in Birthright she somehow has even less say in what happens than she does anywhere else. Incidents like how Takami interacts with Azura in Chapter 5, or him implying he tried to get Azura exiled before multiple times and saying she doesn't have a soul, stick out to me like a sore thumb in this way. Takami is allowed the chance to get better. He's allowed to take up space, but Azura is expected by the game to go out of her way to sacrifice herself and never think about her own situation or inconvenience others. The only route that puts any effort into remedying this is Revelation, because she's finally allowed to talk about things, but even then, it doesn't fix most of it. And so this all just kind of piles on more reasons to hate this scene for me, because it's just putting it plain to see by having Iago make him once again target Azura for no goddamn reason in a symbolic fuck you towards any chance of Fates treating Azura as though she is a human being who deserves to ever be prioritized, whether over Corrin or Takumi or any other character. His development, heavy quotations there, feels like it comes at Azura's expense, which is especially shitty when you consider that his biggest flaw, the reason he needed development, was that he treated Azura like fucking garbage. Now, to be fair, this issue isn't necessarily unique to Takumi. In fact, I very often see people make a similar argument with Corrin, where Azura just plays second fiddle to Corrin and is treated as less of a priority. This holds weight, to be sure, but the reason it doesn't feel like anywhere near as much of a slap in the face for me is Corrin is one of the only characters that consistently checks up on her and seems to actually care a little bit. And honestly, this is part of why I don't hate Corrin as much as a lot of people do, but I'm getting sidetracked. He finally snaps out of it, and it's clearly supposed to be this big moment, but it means absolutely nothing because his problems all just got resolved within the span of 2 minutes, and there is no word about these feelings that made Takumi susceptible to this mind control before or after this scene. The only exception to this is him very briefly bringing it up all the way back during his recruitment, and even then, it was again still while he was being controlled. It lacks any kind of meaningful build-up required to allow it to have some kind of emotional payoff. It just happens, and then we move on. It's completely pointless and does nothing for the character. Leo shows up afterwards to once again have a gamer moment and kill steal instead of just letting Corrin skewer Iago's brain, much like how Iago dies in Conquest, but it feels worse here because we don't even get the satisfaction of someone in our party killing him. Next, we'll have to fight Xander, and Xander is absolutely brain dead here. Xander, literally being Garen's right-hand man, still refuses to acknowledge that Garen is evil. He states here that justice is an illusion, which completely goes against what is established of his character during his supports. He challenges Corrin to a duel and nearly kills them before Elise steps in and takes the fatal blow and tells Xander to stop fighting. So what does he do? He completely ignores it and keeps fighting. Before anyone says it, yes, I understand that the implication is that he's doing a suicide by cop by intentionally throwing the fight. They do imply this while Xander is dying, but considering so many people missed it, I'm guessing that this was way too vague for most. But it's also just too little and too late. By itself, just having a character die tragically isn't going to do anything to redeem them if they've helped the bad guys the whole time. If the game was still insistent on Xander dying, then a better way of going about this is maybe having Xander come to his senses after the fight, agreeing to come with us, and then he dies a little while later helping us fight Garen, sacrificing himself for the cause in an attempt to right his wrongs. He says after this that Garen has changed, so he clearly saw that Garen was a bad dude, and this whole time he just ignored it? Why? I suppose it's because he's too afraid to stand up to Garen, or perhaps feels some responsibility to obey him, but they never say much of anything about it. I think this could work a little better in a version of Fates where Garen is, at the bare minimum, better at hiding that he's evil, and explored this implication with Xander feeling chained to this responsibility in more depth. But as it is, it just kinda comes across as an excuse to have Xander oppose the party. Honestly, the Norian siblings don't feel like they should be antagonists at all, and Birthright really seems to reach for reasons to have them be that anyway. Xander and Camilla taking a psychological turn for the worse, and Leo giving up and fucking off somewhere is the only way they can even get them to act as this in the story, and even then, it's barely so. Which means the villain game for Birthright is super weak, because hardly anyone other than Garen and his objectively evil, shallow goons bothers to put up any kind of substantial or consistent obstacle to the party. I keep having to say this, but all of this immediately gets resolved if you just don't make Nor evil. And just as a side note, this map is so bad. Not because it's hard or frustrating, but because it sets you up with this emotional track and everything, and then you literally just hit the boss with a rolled up newspaper and he dies immediately in like a single turn. There's no reason to even engage with the rest of the map at all. It is, without exaggeration, just as easy and simple as the first time you fight Xander in the tutorial. I bring this up in a video about the story only because when it's this easy and short, it really takes away from the tension of the situation in the story proper. Not that there was much of that to begin with. It's super anticlimactic and left me feeling deflated that a moment that was so hyped up by the game was so underwhelming due to the gameplay. We go shoot Garen in the head, he transforms into the Dusk Dragon, and then we die. It's at this point we get a scene that's supposed to mirror another part in Conquest. I don't have too much to say about it, as just about everything I wanted to say I already went over in the Conquest section, but this version does avoid the issue where it doesn't fit into the plot due to some of the complaints people had about the dialogue between Takumi and Korin in that one. We kill the final boss, Azura pieces out, which leads us to the ending. I think the ending is better executed than it is in Conquest, even though they're really similar. It doesn't make you run into Camilla's tits in first person, at the very least. And oh my god, the characters are interacting with each other? Just talking like normal people? Unthinkable, this literally does not happen anywhere else in the entirety of Birthright. The bar must truly be in hell. I guess it's fitting that the best part of Birthright is when it ends. Oh, except for when they forgot Azura died and then had to be reminded in order to feel sad for her, that was really fucking stupid. And that's Birthright. It was easily the most forgettable of the trilogy. I would find it more enriching to be lectured for 3 hours about the history of the Balkans. There are a few things that do make Birthright stand out, but none of them have anything to do with the story, namely the Japanese aesthetic and the classes unique to Birthright given to complement this. But a simple aesthetic change isn't enough to redeem the game, because usually how something looks isn't going to be enough to push most players to the finish line without everything else that makes a video game enjoyable, namely either the gameplay and level design or the narrative. And it's not like the new classes are something you can only access in Birthright or that you can only go to Hoshido in this route. One of the biggest issues with Birthright by itself, as I have briefly mentioned previously, is that it lacks any semblance of structure. Take pretty much any individual chapter other than chapter 27 in the endgame where you don't recruit one of the royals and try to think of how the story would be different if it wasn't in the game. Around 85% of the total chapters in the game could be removed and the story would stay the exact same. Even things like Azura telling you her song will kill her take up very little time and could be put in any other chapter without making a lick of difference, and it never actually has anything to do with whatever else is happening on screen. So much of the game is mindless filler, and the plot for individual chapters are never very interesting to begin with. It's not like they spend any time focusing on the politics of the war or establishing their tone or anything else, really. Even Conquest spent the first part of the game with the intent to test Korin's pacifism. Moments like the Ice Tribe or Chief or going toe-to-toe for the first time against one of Korin's siblings at the port all feel like they have a purpose, they have weight to them, and as such, they're, get this, memorable. Things that seem like they should be important, like the party allying itself with Chief, only matter for 5 minutes, and even during that time, it is never interesting. It doesn't have a structure, it doesn't have any memorable moments, it doesn't have a focus, it doesn't have an emotional core, it doesn't have any good themes or secondary goals, it barely has any good characters. It's a fragile skeleton of a story held together with toilet paper and used gum. What does it have? Face petting, I guess. Something about this route all feels so inexplicably condescending. Like it's saying, good job you fucking idiot, you bought the correct product this time, but oh wait, there's an even better one on the horizon. It's why I despise characters like Aburo who just exist to disrespect any sense of ambiguity and disrespect the player's time playing Conquest. This aspect of Fates is both preachy and vapid all at once, trying to come across as though it's saying something while saying nothing. It is shockingly egotistical and has absolutely no right to be. People like to say that Birthright is the best route story-wise because it doesn't have as many plot holes. But in a shocking twist, it turns out that it's easier to avoid plot holes when you don't have an actual plot, and also never try to have an actual plot. The fact that it still has them anyway speaks to how absolutely high the writing team was. And plot holes are very far from the only thing that matters when critiquing fiction. I won't deny that Birthright looks the most inoffensive and put together at a first glance. But then that almost makes it worse once you actually start to think about it, because it's like they knew this shit was stupid and instead of fixing it, they just made it all less obvious. I can't even say that there's some kind of potential for it due to having interesting concepts like there is with Conquest, because what concepts? Fates as a whole has concepts that I like. I wouldn't be making this video if it didn't, but almost none of that is unique to Birthright. It's only ever the things that apply generally to all routes. Is this all too harsh? This section may come across as though I'm being dismissive. After all, I've admitted before that I've pretty much always had a sour opinion of this route in particular. I assure you though, I'm not trying to be dismissive. But maybe it's kinda shit for the same reason Donkey is bad at reviewing JRPGs. If you already knew you'd hate something going in, and then end up proving yourself right, does that really mean anything? Is that truly a reflection on the quality of the work? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. I won't deny that much of this is likely just reverse psychology because of the obvious bias the game puts in, but you can see why resentment would naturally bubble up. But is that really a reasonable way to judge a game? I don't know. I thought for a while on this, and trust me when I say I really struggled writing this part. I struggled between wanting to be honest about how I felt and not wanting to come across as misleading towards its faults. But man, I'm still not able to endear myself to any of this. Even if I ignore its more glaringly bad plot points, even more damning than having a lot of weaknesses is being devoid of strengths, devoid of identity. I think it's telling that whenever people bring up Birthright's story as the reason why it's the best one in the trilogy, the only praise they give it is simply that it isn't conquest or revelation, and that, ironically, could not be more condemning towards Birthright. It is never about what Birthright does well, or even what it tries to do, because even the people who think it has the best story can't come up with anything. And if you need more convincing for why Birthright is worse from a storytelling perspective, let me remind you that the war crimes may be fictional, but the irritation I feel at this cast of characters is entirely real. It is a worse sin in fiction to be unlikable than it is to be evil. At the very least, even if you do think this is unfair, I want you to honestly think on it and consider it every time you see people criticize Revelation because the other routes led up to it in a monetarily exploitative and self-important way. It's totally fine if you come away from this disagreeing with me or coming to a conclusion of bias or contrarianism on my part, not that you'd necessarily be entirely wrong, but I don't think it hurts to question our own opinions on things and revise them. It isn't shameful to do so, it's how we grow as people. In conclusion, Birthright took a shit in my cereal and turned me into a broken man. And then the third route came in and said, hey, why don't I throw the entire point of this story off a 7-story balcony, set it on fire, and then piss on the debris. I already find the idea of a neutral route to be kind of lackluster, but I don't think it had to be anywhere near this damning either. A neutral route where you don't get everyone on your side and aren't suddenly able to save everyone might be okay, but that's a very big emphasis on the word might. But Revelation is a golden route where everyone lives, which means that yes, Revelation is a canon event. Everything I said before about the choice between Nora and Hoshido is thrown in the dumpster here. It makes you wonder what the point was of choosing a country and establishing it as the indisputable canonical route just rubs salt into the wound. Fates really tries to funnel you into playing Revelation as best as it can in a way not too dissimilar to the dynamic between Conquest and Birthright. Although, admittedly, even though I know that's the whole point of Revelation, it did always feel significantly less egregious about this to me, though I'm aware that's probably somewhat of an unpopular opinion, and I can see why. Although it doesn't feel nearly as outright malicious about it, you can't deny that the entirety of Revelation is built around this idea, something I can't really say as much about the other routes. And since Revelation is the route where everyone is on your side, the cast is horrendously bloated. This doesn't just harm the balancing in the gameplay. There's just too many characters with not enough screen time for any of them, which means that the royals are somehow even more criminally underdeveloped than they already were. In Birthright and Conquest, there's always 4 royals not counting Corrin and Azura, and while the other 2 routes often fail at fully developing the royals as it is, it would have at least been possible to do so given the length of the game under more competent writers. But in Revelation, we have 10 main characters total in a game that's like 20 to 30 hours. It is impossible to give all of those characters the time they need without either rushing through plot points or bombarding the player with extremely long cutscenes. So Revelation's solution is to just completely forget about every character that isn't Corrin beyond their most basic traits. The royals all just kind of exist. They never do anything of note, and whatever character arcs they may have had in the previous 2 routes are all but completely completely removed. We start out Revelation with Corrin saying they don't want to fight either side. Immediately, they brand Corrin a traitor. But even though Corrin is trying to explain themselves, neither Ryoma nor Xander listens at all, to the point it comes across as them willfully ignoring everything Corrin is saying. I think all three choices make some sense for Corrin as a character, and I'm not making an exception here. They choose Hoshido because it's the good guy option, they choose Nor because that's where everybody they've ever known is, and they choose neutrality because they're naive and think that they can get the two sides to stop fighting, and don't want to fight any of the people they care about, so they just kinda peace out. Azura joining you here doesn't make any sense. She joins you in Birthright because you've officially sided yourself with the Hoshidan royal family, so that makes sense, and in Conquest she joins you because she's been exiled and has no other choice. But in Revelation she just kinda tags along for no reason, even though she knows this will likely result in her being branded a traitor as well. Azura just immediately trusts Corrin the day after meeting them for no reason, here even to the point of willingly leaving everything else behind. The next chapter is when we actually go to Vala, but the method with which we go there is infamously stupid. We jump down the canyon. Firstly, Corrin has no way of knowing if Azura is telling the truth and quite literally just met her. I don't need to clarify why jumping off a bridge because someone you just met told you to is a bad decision. Additionally, this risk is unnecessary in the same way Kaze's death in Birthright was. Corrin has a dragon form and yet nobody thinks to use that here. We also didn't need to jump down to get to Vala in Conquest, going through a portal Azura opened up in the water instead. I'm going to give this the benefit of the doubt and say it's likely that this is something only Corrin and Azura can do since they're both descendants of the Valite royal family, and so we can't use it since Jacob or Felicia is here. But they don't explicitly clarify this, which is strange. I will say, there's one thing I really like about the beginning of Revelation. You're completely alone. Both of Corrin's families have abandoned them, and I like the somber tone that this brings, even if it doesn't last very long. It's so odd, the way they try to establish Corrin and Azura as fast friends, but completely go off the deep end and have the both of them take a life-risking trust fall for each other immediately after they meet. Their relationship, despite being in theory a vital part of Fates, is never truly believable, nor is it emphasized in the way it should. More often than not, she comes across as a distant guide of sorts rather than as two close friends. Azura gives us a bunch of exposition, but what's really odd to me is the information at the end of the chapter. The mechanics behind who can access Vala and when. The way to Vala is only open when the skies above Nor and Hoshido reverse. This is vague and completely goes against the rest of the world building. I would imagine this means that Hoshido would go into a constant night and that Nor would have sunlight, and that they switch every few decades. But Nor is explicitly supposed to be a kingdom stuck in eternal night. So which is it? They seem to completely contradict each other. This never comes up in Conquest or Birthright, and a few decades is a really vague time frame. It could be anywhere from 20 years to 90. When we get to Fort Jinya, Yukimura is somehow even more of an asshole than usual for no reason. It really seems like Revelation characterized everyone as being either way more suspicious of Corrin than usual or way more trusting of them. Saizo tries to charge up some ultimate attack that he says will kill him, even though I have no idea what this is, and this never comes up anywhere else. Revelation is so strange to me because of how obviously out of character everyone is. They will seemingly react completely differently to Corrin's perceived betrayal than they do in the other route where Corrin sides against them. We start the next chapter by Camilla saying she senses something not of this world, which never comes up in any other route. Immediately afterwards is the scene at the Eternal Stairway, which is the exact same scene as the one in Birthright, where they defeat the Faceless and then realize the Faceless are made from people. Proving my point about everyone acting out of character in regards to Corrin, Rinka shows up out of nowhere to defend them, even though she does no such thing in Conquest. Zola shows up a little later to do his whole Izana shtick again, and in doing so decides to encase an entire town in ice. I thought before that it was snow, but no, the game refers to it as ice. Leaving aside that this means that everyone in the town should probably be dead, we defeat Zola and he gets killed by, surprise surprise, Leo again. I know Fates likes to reuse plot points and all, but so far Revelation seems to be doing a lot more of it. Leo intentionally misses an attack that was supposedly aimed at Corrin and hits the door revealing the hostages instead, so it seems like, much like in Birthright, he just kinda puts on a show of hating you. At least Leo is semi-consistent across routes, even if no one else is. The real Izana is released alongside Takumi and the rest of the prisoners to tell us a prophecy, and then he dies. Apparently there's a certain kind of ritual he needs to do here, but it costs him his life. How is this one different from the other prophecies he's done? I think they could have used this much more effectively, as in have Azana talk about the situation with Vala and then have him disappear as a result of the curse. Then everyone knows for a fact Corrin is telling the truth instead of just following along blindly. How is anyone following Corrin when they won't even tell their teammates what they're doing? It requires a leap of trust that nobody except maybe the people Corrin grew up with would ever logically take in good faith. And nobody Corrin grew up with or knew well before this point is in the party right now except for Jacob or Felicia and Gunter, and they all saw Vala with their own eyes. Everyone else here is holding a massive idiot ball for joining us when we can't even say what we're fighting. What's even more shocking is that Takumi, of all people, who if you remember has a whole thing about how much he doesn't trust anyone, in this chapter is receptive to the idea. He just immediately trusts Corrin with no evidence, even though as far as he knows this situation is basically the same to him. Not much of note really happens in the next chapter, it just kinda lazily reuses the Kotaro subplot from the other two routes again. Something really odd is that Kaze can see a smoke signal and immediately conveniently know not only that it's a warning signal rather than a distress signal, but also that it's very specifically from Saizo. It expects me to believe there's no one else on the continent that makes smoke signals the same way, and you just know that it was thrown in because the writing team was crunched for time and couldn't think of a better way to relay this information to the party. They also seem to really like front-loading all of the birthright units for some reason. It kind of seems like it would make more sense for it to be the other way around though, since obviously the Norian units know Corrin well and therefore would be more open to trusting them. But Gunter is the only conquest unit we've gotten so far in comparison to 11 birthright units. This means that despite the whole thing with Revelation being to get the two sides to work together, you never actually see that until the second half of the story, and by that point, the game is no longer focusing on the two sides getting to know each other as much as it's focusing on Vala and Inankos. Later on, we fight Camilla and Flora. Flora is blackmailed into fighting you, even though this doesn't happen in Birthright until way later. This makes me wonder about how long each route takes in universe. This would imply that Revelation takes longer, except we can guess that's probably not true, because not only does Birthright start with a time skip, but they also explicitly say they're running against the clock due to the way to Vala potentially closing soon. Camilla not going home in fear of being executed also never happens in Birthright, even though, again, the situation is the same from Nor's perspective. I'd say that they made it like this to give it different story beats as opposed to Birthright and Conquest, but they end up reusing plot points every 10 seconds anyway. Also, it's ironic how Takumi talks to Azura about not just trusting people because they're your siblings, considering his recruitment earlier. I think his split personalities are fighting for dominance in his head again. We move on to chapter 13, where I can't help but feel like we probably look like we've lost our goddamn minds. Corrin keeps insisting that there's an invisible enemy of sorts, but obviously nobody believes them. I almost get secondhand embarrassment every time our party starts talking about how there's an invisible enemy in the shadows, because outside of the perspective of the player and what we know, it's completely ridiculous. And I know the Valite soldiers are supposed to be invisible, kind of, but our party can clearly see them well enough to fight them. Why can't Xander and Ryoma? Seeing them is never an issue in the other two routes either. Does everyone except for our party just have cataracts all of a sudden? And it's not like it's consistent within Revelation either, because they have no problem seeing and fighting the Valite soldiers later on. It's similar to the issue I had with the smoke signal. Like, oh yeah, I just conveniently know or don't know this thing, even though it makes no sense as to why I would or would not have that knowledge. Azura then sings her song, and everyone on the battlefield loses their will to fight. In the other two routes, I thought her song's powers were actually quite consistent. They're supposed to weaken Inankos' hold over someone. Keep in mind, the final bosses for both routes were possessed by Inankos, and she is obviously singing throughout the level if the soundtrack is anything to go by. During her performance at Circensia, especially during Conquest, she is again using it against Garen, who, as we've already established, is possessed. One notable exception to this is when Corrin transforms right before the route split, but Corrin is Inankos' child, so of course it works on Corrin too, since that's where they got their dragon side in the first place. Unless I'm forgetting, I can't really think of any time in Birthright and Conquest where it diverges and breaks these rules. But here the song just kinda does whatever the plot wants it to. Corrin's interactions with Xander and Ryoma afterwards are a bit off too. Even considering all the debate with how Xander is in Birthright, I still thought he was a lot colder here than he pretty much ever is in any other route. Plus there's the whole implication that he's suicidal and wants you to kill him if you choose Birthright, but here he's just kind of a dick. And then there's Ryoma. His interaction with Corrin is fine, but then he just talks to Takumi and Sakura like nothing happened and is completely fine with it. He doesn't even try to get them back, he's just like, cool, come back with cigarettes. You've already made it clear you don't trust Korin, so why are you okay with this? And then there's Scarlet. She has no evidence or reason to believe that what we're saying is true, and to any reasonable person, assuming they truly can't see the Valite soldiers, we probably look like we have tinfoil hats on our heads. But she buys it, and the reasoning she gives is that Korin is related to Ryoma and that Korin's eyes look trustworthy, even though we haven't met her before this. As a little side nitpick, Camilla has dialogue with Xander if they engage each other in battle. But for some reason, Ryoma has no such thing with Takumi or Sakura, even though he does have battle dialogue with his retainers and Korin. It bothers me way more than it should. Did they just forget to add it to the game, or are they refusing to acknowledge each other because they both think it's super fucking awkward? The next chapter starts with a look into what's happening at Castle Krakenberg, where Garen starts talking about how both Hoshido and Nor are useless to him. This is enough to convince Leo that he shouldn't be working for Garen. I understand that the reasoning for this is that in Revelation he has the added context where Korin is convinced Garen is being controlled. But then it makes Korin's and Azura's decision in Conquest to not tell anyone the truth about Garen even worse, because now we know for a fact that Leo would have believed them if he was shown what was in the crystal ball. Xander tells Leo off for this, even though he changes his mind just a couple of chapters later when he shows up at the bottomless canyon with no explanation as to why or what caused this sudden change of heart. If he changed his mind while traveling to the bottomless canyon, then we should have seen that. Instead, it's just more inconsistent characterization. And it goes to show how characters just get forgotten about and made to fit the story, rather than the story being made to fit the characters. There was this whole implication in Birthright regarding Xander's mental state, and a justification hinted as to why he was so standoffish there. Not a good justification, but a justification that the game attempts nonetheless. Here, it feels like a lost, unfinished thread, showing you Xander disliking Korin's actions, and then the game decides that it needs to hurry along to the point where Xander accepts what Korin is saying, and then forgets all of it entirely. Since these characters were likely already set in stone before Revelation's plot was finalized, they end up being forced to act a certain way just to make it all work. Literally killing Azana and having him guilt Takumi, and then conveniently having possession not be an issue just so that he doesn't spend the rest of the game trying to murder you, is one of the more ungraceful ways Fate tries to fit characters in your party. Or Azura just also deciding that she wants to be branded a traitor too at the beginning of Revelation. Or Rinka showing up to join us even though in any other circumstance she's supposed to be aloof and relatively untrusting. In particular, it's obvious that so many of the Norian and Hoshidan characters were literally not made to be able to get along with each other. The simplest solution is to just not let you recruit everyone. Because even though they spend the rest of the game outside Revelation being at each other's throats 24/7, there are certainly some characters that make sense to being more open to allying with the opposing side that aren't necessarily route neutral, like Sakura and Elise for example, or the Awakening trio. But some of these characters I'm pretty sure might actually try to kill each other if they get put in the same room. Aboro, the bigoted Hoshidan nationalist whom the game wants you to think had a point, and Perry, the Norian serial killer whom the game wants you to think had a point, spoiler, neither of them do, should not be on the same team together. I think the universe would explode if anyone tried. There is just no possible timeline where everyone makes sense in this arrangement because so many of them were written from the ground up to hate each other, even with Korin and Azura there to act as a middle ground. So this all just makes the fact that you get everyone even dumber. We recruit Silas later on. Something I always found interesting is how Silas always states what Korin's favorite food is during his recruitment, and how it's also different between routes. This is a much more intentional thing though. It's subtly trying to show you that each version of Korin is a similar yet different person, these minor differences in personality resulting in a different decision being made at the Branch of Fate, which I just think is a neat little detail, okay? We go to Noder Sages and meet a totally not suspicious old man who gives us directions so we can meet the Rainbow Sage. Once we actually get to the room where the Rainbow Sage is, that same old man turns out to be the guy we were looking for. I'm not sure what the point was of disguising himself as a slightly different looking old man, since it's not like they're going to recognize him based on looks alone. I guess it's more so for the player, since Revelation assumes you've played the other two routes and already know what the Rainbow Sage looks like, but no one who's played Birthright or Conquest is going to see this and not immediately think it's the Rainbow Sage, so this is all just kinda silly. He gives us our plot-mandated Yato power-up, and the legendary weapons just aren't needed for it this time somehow. Even though we have Takumi in our party, so there's not really an excuse as to why we're not just using the Fujin Yumi for this. At this point, I'm really confused as to how the Yato upgrade system even works. You need to have a legendary weapon with you, except for when you don't actually, and the weapons activate with each other whenever they feel like it, or whenever the Rainbow Sage uses his powers to make it happen manually, except for that one time where it happened because Xander underwent important development, and then nothing like that happened again, even though that made the most narrative sense. The Rainbow Sage tells us he's one of the first dragons, has another heart attack, and dies again. Like, yeah, it's not as egregious as it is for Conquest, where it just exists to give Corrin an out from having to kill him. It's still goofy as shit, though. This death serves no narrative purpose and comes out of left field. Why does it need to happen? What does it add? It shows how derivative Revelation is of the other routes. It reuses things like the Rainbow Sage dying simply because that's what the rest of Fates did, and not because it makes sense here. A large chunk of the story is made up of leftover scraps from everything else, even when there's not really any point to it. It's sloppy and thoughtless. You see this same thoughtlessness in the gameplay too, where not even recruitment levels were adjusted from how they were previously, resulting in situations like Nyx being practically unusable in Revelation, and Shura being ridiculously overleveled because the devs forgot to take the time to adjust the levels. I could open up Paragon and learn how to fix stats and levels in like 2 minutes. There is no excuse for this. The next part has Ryoma in the Hoshiden capital talking to Yukimura. They start talking about Corrin, as everyone in this game does all of the time, when Ryoma states that he was jealous of Corrin's leadership capabilities when they were children. Corrin was implied to be a very young child when they got kidnapped. Ryoma, what the fuck are you talking about? Was Corrin giving inspiring political speeches to the people at the old age of 5? It's at points like these where the protagonist worship is so ridiculous that it transcends all logic and loops back around to being funny to me. In this entire scene, Corrin is never present, and yet that's still all the characters talk about. The rest of the scene is fine in isolation. They talk about the regrets with not being able to save Corrin back then, but when every scene is like this, it really begins to grate on you. And it becomes especially noticeable when you realize they never give this treatment to any of the other royal family members. The next 2 chapters happen in a row, and both the remaining Hoshiden royals and the remaining Norian royals show up to save the day. I actually really like this. Each respective chapter has the Birthright and Conquest battle themes, a light and dark fall, to accompany them. It's a great way to use a theme and makes this segment a lot more memorable. It's all pretty cool, except for the part at the end of the chapter where Azura congratulates the player for buying Revelation in a way that is so direct it basically just breaks the fourth wall. And like I said, these countries are written with the express purpose of despising each other to the point where this alliance doesn't actually make sense. It's like Birthright and Conquest were written to make it as clear as possible that these two sides will just never fully understand each other, that when you come across a route where they do, they have to be written completely differently. But if this is the case, then why does Revelation exist? I'd say that the idea of a third route was something they thought of much later in development, but we know that this isn't actually true. The original draft by Shin Kobayashi had 3 routes, and yet despite that, it still feels tacked on. My working theory is that the original draft of Revelation probably looked like a different story entirely, and the idea to make it a golden route came at the last second, but who knows. Irregardless, we have all the characters now, and because of this, they are all going to become entirely irrelevant after this point. They only exist to assist Corrin and Azura rather than be their own people with goals entirely separate from them. And it becomes especially clear in this route that all the characters revolve around Corrin, where typically they'd have some kind of motivation of their own, usually to ensure their own country wins the war. Here it's simply because Corrin said so. I want you to pick any of the royals and think for a second about what they do in this route after this point separate from Corrin. If the only thing you could think of was grieve over their dying parents in a random cutscene because Anankos likes necromancy, then congratulations. That's because it's the only time they do anything that isn't directly because of Corrin. It's after this point where the plot kind of just loses structure. We've gotten everybody on our side, and now all we really need to do is go fight Anankos. And it means that everything after this point all just kind of blends together. But since we now have everyone on our side, I guess I should discuss what I think is both Revelation's greatest strength and its most glaring weakness. Revelation is unapologetically self-indulgent. If you're trying to tell a serious, high-stakes story, this is bad. And it's especially bad when this results in the good ending being locked behind paid DLC. Because of that, I don't blame people for thinking this is the worst Fire Emblem game. But at the same time, this also makes Revelation fun in a simple, stupid, brain-dead way. You can pair together whoever you want, you have the whole cast at your disposal, you have items from both routes to choose from in shops and highest potential for sandbox-style play, and theory crafting with builds. It was probably not supposed to come across this way, but I still found a subversive joy in it. Because of this, I don't agree with the popular opinion that this is the worst Fire Emblem game. I still think that Dishonor would go to Birthright, which is drier than sawdust. Getting back to the story, Corrin gets to the bridge at the Bottomless Canyon and tells everyone there's a curse and that they need to jump down. This is obviously stupid for the same reasons as before. I'd like to point out, though, that Scarlet, Camilla, and Hinoka all have flying mounts in their canonical classes. If you're going to be naive enough to believe this, the least you could do is use those to guarantee you don't die, because again, you have no way of knowing if Corrin and Azura are telling the truth. And I don't think it's because it's something the writers wanted to avoid due to being able to change their classes, because Hinoka tries to use her Pegasus to save Kaze in Birthright. Before this, Scarlet pins a flower to her shirt, which definitely won't be important later, and jumps down, getting attacked by a Valite ghost and dying. Why is it that in the Golden Route, where everyone lives, there is exactly one character that just dies for no reason? It's pointless. Nobody even bothers to ask where she is until the very end of this chapter. It makes it seem like they all just forgot about her until then. They all have a conversation afterwards, basically dumping exposition, and Azura explains that the invisible soldiers are from Vala, which caused Nor and Hoshido to blame each other and go to war. I know I've already implied that this invalidates the conflict between the two, but honestly, it's already rubble by now. It was always dead on arrival because it never tried to introduce any nuance to the situation. Like I said, it's just pissing on the charred debris at this point. It can't make it worse because it's already as bad as it can possibly be. It's after this point they meet Anthony, the only Valite civilian we see in the game. There's no mention of what town he's from, why he's out here, or if there's anyone else still alive. Based on what gets revealed later, even he might not have ever been a normal civilian of Vala. He states that there are very few people still living here, and that everyone who remains is forced to be a slave to a non-kos. But since he ends up being a villain, there's no way to know if any of this is the truth. If it is, then he's probably one of those people he mentioned forced to work for a non-kos. For all the talk about a non-kos, however, he does a miserable job of actually showing up. The end of this chapter is the first time he shows up in the flesh, and it's in a very short conversation with somebody else in Castle Gygus, and not where Corrin and the crew can see him or talk to him. This is also the last time he'll show up with the exception of the final confrontation. Actually, is this a non-kos? This might be Sumeragi, I'm still not clear on this. A non-kos isn't a good or motivating villain because they commit too hard to him being mysterious, never showing up himself and only sending his cronies to fight us. A villain being shrouded in mystery can be really good, but if done poorly, it just makes them boring. The only time we learn who a non-kos really is in a DLC pack. Just another instance of this game being greedy as hell. And a non-kos just isn't intimidating. He doesn't do anything. He's passive and barely shows up in a story where he's supposed to be the main antagonist. He has no presence and as a result is forgettable. Moving on, Elise is surprised to see the islands are floating even though she just spent the entirety of the last chapter on said floating islands. Which is weird, but whatever. Anthony leads the group across a bridge, which collapses, nearly taking Takumi and Leo down with it. Xander points out that Anthony is strangely calm about this, and everyone else universally agrees Anthony is being sus. Corrin then demonstrates that they have no critical thinking skills and stubbornly insists that there's no way Anthony would betray them. Xander goes on about how Corrin's willingness to believe in people is their greatest strength, but how they need to be more careful. Which makes sense when I say it, but I don't like how the conversation goes on for so long about how this makes Corrin a good person, and then there's only really a single line saying that Corrin should be more diligent. There needs to be more emphasis on Corrin taking responsibility for trusting people they shouldn't. It kind of feels like it's softening the blow on purpose for the audience because of Corrin's nature as a self-insert. And in what is probably the most obvious twist in Fates, Anthony is a traitor. He successfully leads Corrin into a trap that they willingly, knowingly walked into. Corrin left a letter before they left saying that if they didn't return, they had fallen into a trap, and then says that they plan to thin the enemy's numbers in what is essentially a suicide mission. Corrin is the one leading the army. For them to basically throw their life away for no good reason is only going to hurt their army, who will have to pick up where Corrin left off. It's an attempt to make Corrin look smart and like they're playing 5D chess to the audience, but instead of playing 5D chess, they're doing the equivalent of playing tic-tac-toe against a senile dog and losing. There was no reason for Corrin to go with Anthony in the first place, especially when they knew it was a trap. And not just that, they go completely alone with no backup and don't bother to consult any of their allies ahead of time. I did say earlier that characters can and should make stupid decisions if that's what makes sense for them. Your characters are not baby geniuses. But this decision that Corrin makes is seemingly supposed to come across to the audience like they're outplaying everyone, and it ends up being the opposite. If you want it to come across this way, what you'd probably do is have Corrin come up with an actual plan that doesn't involve doing a suicide run. Make Corrin have the other party members wait to ambush Anthony or something. Luckily, the fam shows up just in time to save Corrin's stupid ass, but what baffles me the most is that nobody bothers to hold Corrin responsible for this. They even tell Corrin not to change. This is why Corrin never develops as a character. Everybody goes on another long-winded speech about how this is good actually, and it's fine for Corrin to be a dumbass who risks their own life and the lives of other people. You need to challenge your protagonists sometimes. This is writing 101. And when challenging them, you can't just immediately have all their friends bail them out. This is something we also saw in Conquest. You might put the hero under scrutiny, but if you alleviate all of it without making them learn, it doesn't mean much. The mysterious mage that's been bothering us for a few chapters now reveals herself to be Azura's mother and the late queen of Vala. This is a trope Revelation uses a few different times, and they're supposed to be a replacement for actual villains, but they never really succeed at this. Arete isn't actually Arete, but a puppet being controlled by a Nonkos. The only reason they wear the faces of other people is to get an emotional reaction out of the characters and the audience, but it doesn't actually mean anything. It's a cheap grab at sympathy. It's the same problem I had with the final boss of Conquest, but even more egregious. When the character isn't in control of their own actions and isn't themselves, they are in essence wearing a disguise meant to substitute actual meaningful plot development. In chapter 23, we are treated to Gunter being suspicious, and Ryoma begins talking about Scarlet, which is one of the only times Scarlet is ever mentioned after her death. You even end up fighting her during this map, and yet no one acknowledges that it happened. We finally defeat Arete, and Azura has a scene with her where Arete is herself while she dies. This would probably be a better scene if Azura was a more engaging character, and if they didn't overuse this trope in Revelation. This is the first time it shows up in this route, but multiple scenes exactly like this will play later on. A dead version of a character important to the protagonist, possessed by a Nonkos, will be defeated and regain their senses as they die, having a sad final conversation with said protagonists and disappearing. In Conquest, this exact string of events happened once, and while it has issues there, it was never because it felt stale or overused the way it is in Revelation. In fact, this exact sequence of events is going to play out again in the next chapter and the chapter after, and that's pretty much all these segments are. Makoto and Sumeragi are brought back as zombies, you kill them, they have their monologues with Corrin and the Hoshiden royals. The only real plot development that happens here is the revelation that wasn't even intentional, that Corrin is not related to the Hoshiden royal family, but is actually Valite. However, Makoto fails to mention who Corrin's real father is. Knowing who it is, this seems like a really huge plot point that you never see in the main game. The fact that you never find out that Anonkos is Corrin's real father in the route where he is the main villain, and instead find out in a DLC is insanity. And even in that DLC, Corrin isn't present when the audience finds this out. Corrin literally never gets to learn this information, even taking into account every single bit of extra content. This is extra insulting because Revelation itself is technically already DLC, and it doesn't even have the courtesy of telling you after you buy it. You could have had some kind of actually engaging twist in Revelation if this was included, and it makes it all the more daft that they don't tell you here when so little interesting is happening in Revelation as is. Nothing all too eventful happens until chapter 26, where we finally get to know who the imposter is. It is, unsurprisingly, Gunter. Gunter is confusing to me. There was never any mention of this possession when you get him in Conquest. When did this start? Every other character that was under mind control died first, but for some reason Gunter is the only one who's alive during it. Even though Takumi was taken over while he was still alive at the Great Wall, it really seems like the implication is that Anankos threw him off the ledge specifically so that he could take total control. Speaking of, it really seems like this is the route where Takumi would be the most susceptible to this, being in Vala, and yet this is the only route where it never comes up at all. Which I guess means it's time for me to fully talk about how inconsistently possession works. It's been established at this point that Garen is long dead and that this is the only thing keeping him going. But Garen is the only one that doesn't have this purple flame effect or phase in and out of sight during animations. He's also the only one with gray skin, which I assume means he's started to decay, but nobody ever points this out as being abnormal, and none of the other possessed characters are ever shown with those same signs of decay, even characters that have been dead for a very long time. Is it just supposed to be a visual cue for the audience? It's only during this route they're ever called invisible, so they do acknowledge here that these effects in their animations are something the characters see as well, but the difference in how they're treated across routes, being that they're intended to be invisible here, but this is not implied to be the case in other routes, has me confused on whether this is supposed to be something that only we as the player see, or something that the characters can see as well. That point about the visual cues may all sound like a somewhat minor thing, and it probably is, but I'm gonna complain about it anyway. I think it just goes to show how little care was put into making everything work consistently. Certain characters also behave differently when under this. Characters like Garen and Mikoto still act like they're just kicking as usual, but Takumi shambles around and can barely do so much as string sentences together. It also never bothers to explain how it sets in the first place. It's typically agreed upon from what I can gather that this happens when a character has been to Vala and is either experiencing some kind of mental anguish or is dead. But the reason I say it's typically agreed upon by fans is because the game itself never bothers to explain these parameters. And that's leaving aside how sometimes it takes complete effect immediately and then everywhere else it's an entire process. Without some kind of explanation for why it seems to work differently sometimes, it's all just really strange. With that tangent aside, let's get back to the matter at hand. Gunter and Corrin have a back and forth about how Corrin still wants to believe in people. Corrin's personality is just seemingly not at all affected by the events of the story. They made a big deal about Corrin being super trusting just a few chapters ago, but instead of it being a learning experience, they coddle Corrin, and as a result, we see them double down. Having a protagonist that is trusting to the point of stupidity is a very common trope that kind of branches off of the idealistic hero archetype. It's a cliche, but one that can be good if you explore it, experiment with it, and still make them an interesting character separate from it. But it's just played straight to the point of boredom a lot of the time. And that's exactly what happens here. They never play with it or challenge Corrin as a person in Revelation. The battle starts and an aura surrounds Corrin and Azura, and they both think it's Aret and Mikoto watching over them. I find this to be really corny, and so I'm not a fan, but it's funny to me to think that Mikoto chose Corrin specifically and not the rest of the Hoshiden royals as well. It's like, wow, I wonder who your favorite child is. Corrin has this whole speech about how much Gunter means to them, which, for me personally, Gunter was never really a character I was all too invested in, so it fell flat for me. But the fact that Gunter is immediately forgiven even though he killed Scarlet is really dumb. Again, it's not clear how much control he had over his own actions because the story never bothers to establish this, but it's safe to assume he wasn't under complete control yet. Which means that he did, to some extent, choose to do that. But this is immediately set aside and nobody is mad at him for killing Scarlet. He just gets his Freudian excuse and gets let off the hook with no pushback whatsoever. They don't have to hate him or anything, but he still should have been held way more responsible than he was. With everything else out of the way, it's finally time for the final confrontation. I guess they realize they forgot about the legendary weapons because here they activate all at once for reasons. We then get to witness the creation of the ugliest weapon in the game. Okay, I get that this isn't relevant, but I liked how the Yato looked in the other routes, its previous blue form and Revelation included. It's got just the right amount of detail while still looking slick, but the flaming rainbow chainsaw sword is an unmitigated fucking disaster. And I know that the dialogue in Fates is generally not good, but it is especially bad here. Like, what the fuck is this? Did you think you were writing fire on the page? Oh yeah, and then Garen shows up. Even though Garen is this big villain in Birthright and Conquest, in Revelation they just completely forgot about him. And then he just gets vored within a matter of 20 seconds after showing up. Garen gets completely sidelined in this route, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The Norian siblings get a grand total of around 5 lines with him, and all of these lines are just each of them stating how surprised they are. There is no real time spent with this. Keep in mind, the Hoshidan royals got 2 very long, redundant cutscenes with their dead parents where they milked it for as long as they possibly could. Wow, it's almost as though it's another way the writers very obviously preferred one side over the other. I guess I still just wish that we'd gotten to see who Garen was before, and this would have been a perfect opportunity to fit it in, even if it still would have been too late in the story and not the correct route to emphasize it. I need to emphasize that this should be a much bigger deal than it is. He is the main antagonist and driving force everywhere else in Fates, and it's a defining part of his character that he used to be kinder and suddenly grew cold. It was way more important to have a scene of Garen being his normal self than it ever could have been for Makoto or Sumeragi. But no, fuck that, let's just have him show up out of nowhere and then immediately die with no fanfare. You may as well have just killed him off screen at that point. There's not really much else to say before we fight the final boss. My most major issue with this ending is, why is Corrin crowned the leader of Vala? Yes, Corrin is Valite nobility, but Azura was their princess, and there's nothing to hint that Corrin was somehow closer in line for the throne. They just cut to Corrin's coronation with no context. You could maybe make the argument that being a non-Kosa's child makes Corrin the rightful heir, but none of the characters know that. They do explain a little later that Azura didn't really want to lead, but also that it's because the Yato chose Corrin, and this is literally only in the game because self-insert. There's a line explaining that Hoshido and Nor donated land to the new Vala, which I guess brings me to my next question. What Vala? It was destroyed. There's no living civilians left that we know of. Are all the other countries gonna send people over to live there? I guess that makes sense, but it just feels weird to me. Corrin mentions when talking to Azura how her song seems like it was written for them, and based on what we know from the DLC, sadly, that is completely right. The rest of the ending plays out, and that's Revelation wrapped up. If there's one more nice thing I'd like to say about Revelation, it's that it does a mildly better job with the nuance between the two countries. And I say only mildly because it still doesn't really talk about the moral justification for each country at all. But the other 2 routes quite literally tell you every 5 seconds about how Nor is a bunch of assholes and about how Hoshido can do no wrong, and the fact that Revelation is the route to take a step back and say you've already played the other 2 routes, I'm not gonna treat you like you're a dumb little piece of shit and can't tell, is so much less grating. Both Birthright and Conquest take such a patronizing approach to morality and how its audience perceives that morality, weaponizing it purely for the sake of getting the player to spend more money on it. Revelation tries to focus instead on what Nor and Hoshido have in common rather than the same shit Fates has already told you 16,000 times. I suppose this naturally brings up the theme of commonality in Revelation. It could be argued that the theme of Revelation is that people have a lot more in common than we might think, and that we should probably start setting aside petty differences if we want to get anything done. Like, soon preferably. You could probably just boil this down to don't be racist, I am a building, but in all seriousness, it's fine. It works well enough. I will admit, it may seem a little odd. Revelation has a lot of the same issues Birthright does. It loses its structure halfway through, the characters never do anything important except for Corrin and Azura, and it still doesn't really seem to care about the whole family aspect that much. But most of all, the dynamic between each route establishes once again a pecking order and undeniably tries to put Revelation at the top of that. All of which were major issues I had with Birthright. This game should offend me, and yet for some reason it doesn't. I think that there's a few different reasons for this. I think that much of it is the fact that they scaled back the atrociously bad dynamic between Nor and Hoshido. It's obviously still not good that they went, oh, it was actually Dragon Satan the whole time, but it is much less intrusively obnoxious. As for the dynamic between routes, this is something that most people agree that Revelation is the worst about. I understand, I truly do. Revelation is even built around the idea. but it is very important to note how the approach each route takes to this is fundamentally different. The way Fates draws you towards revelation is as this carrot on a stick act. It is, and this feels weird to say, more subtle about it. It's less intrusive. You can, if you want, pretend revelation doesn't exist and the story for the most part still feels complete. The way the game gets you to play Birthright, on the other hand, is actively malicious and is also literally impossible to ignore. I think that means we're done with the individual routes. Finally, thank God. So what else do I have to say? I guess there's also the DLC. I don't think there's really much of interest there, though, and also I don't want to, so there. I think that in some ways, Fates never got past the throwing around ideas phase, because like I've stated, the game has good ideas, but they don't synergize with each other whatsoever. Take, for example, Corrin, who is a member of multiple royal families because the game's concept hinges on it, but then they're also a dragon, but then they're also chosen to wield the Yato. How are these ideas supposed to complement each other? Or like how Birthright is supposed to be about Corrin's blood family, but then they make them not related to you because, oh wait, we still want to add fan service too. Singular aspects of Fates may sound nice by itself, but get completely ruined by the context of everything that surrounds it because of how they contradict each other on such an inherent level. And a lot of my complaints wouldn't be a big deal if they were just a problem by themselves. If an individual character was kinda annoying, or if one scene was kinda shitty, or if it was just that an individual arc was kinda weak. It might be easy to dismiss some of my complaints as petty, but when they are happening constantly and nothing else in the story is bothering to pick up any of the slack, you can see how even small things can add up. Yeah, of course there are other games that use some of the same tropes Fates does, including tropes that I took issue with, including games that I genuinely love. But the issue is either that A, Fates doesn't do them that well, or B, it would typically only be one aspect of something otherwise good, and therefore easier to ignore than it is here. I feel like I used the word context quite a bit, but there's a reason I harped on it like I did. Conquest's guilt complex wouldn't be as shitty if it weren't for the fact that you buy its opposite route for the game to immediately treat you significantly nicer. Birthright being uncritical of the player wouldn't be as big of a deal if it weren't for the fact that its opposite route couldn't be further from that. They make each other worse. The context is what damns them. Every major issue the game has a way of being amplified by everything else in the story in a way that I have genuinely never seen any fictional story fuck up to this extent. It can't just have mistakes, it needs to double down on them too. Non-lethally killing people happens in a lot of games. You don't usually see people complain about it there, but that's because those other games don't try to make it a major story point when most of these encounters are potentially very wide-scale battles between armies in a proper war where the fighting for each battle goes way beyond just what your controllable party members are doing. You see what I mean? It doubles down. I find it especially disappointing that the writing of Fates is like this because it had pretty much everything else figured out. The mechanics are great, they finally fixed pair up from Awakening so it was actually balanced, the maps in Conquest especially are difficult yet rewarding, and the game is really beautiful aesthetically. The dark purples and other gem tones that highlight the predominantly black colors of Norse character designs and Gothic architecture make the country look significantly grittier than previous European Fire Emblem settings. And it contrasts perfectly with Hoshido, having a much brighter color palette with a lot of white and vibrant primary colors, with a distinctly Japanese aesthetic to mirror Nor. Even Vala looks great with its bizarre dreamlike landscape and slight water theming in its characters. The UI uses colors that really pop out, and the pre-rendered CG cutscenes look like they're straight out of an anime. Especially with the opening movie. This is easily one of the best looking 3DS games. And the music fucking bangs. Every route has god tier music in this game. All of this deserved to complement a better story. Its concept deserved better. I find it telling that the story for Three Houses has so many similarities. It has multiple routes, a first part of the story intended to get you attached to the characters you didn't choose, and then making you fight and kill them later on. It feels as though Intelligent Systems knew the concept was always good and wanted to prove that they could do better, that they could redeem this idea that they had. Did they succeed? Well, I certainly think that they did, even if the fandom for Three Houses makes me want to commit arson. This is why I find the idea of the rewrites that people attempt of this game to be so fascinating and yet so bound to fail. People look at popular points brought against the game and incorporate that and only that. Even if someone wants to look deeper, you eventually realize you need to change more and more of the foundational aspects of the story. After a certain point, you end up asking yourself, is this still the same game? Or is it something entirely different that just just so happens to share some surface level similarities. I say this not to discourage aspiring writers, but just as a warning. It's something that may look easy enough on the surface, but once you get into it, you only thrust yourself further into the madness before eventually realizing that Fates is even more pathetically broken at its core than you could have ever thought. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's something I've never seen attempted entirely successfully. So much of the discourse surrounding Fates relies on a game of telephone where people might have the right idea at first, but it eventually gets watered down, emphasized, and repeated to the point of not meaning anything, oversimplified, and the game becomes a lolcow to point and laugh at rather than seriously consider. So much of it reduces down to Garen bad, Corin stupid internet upvotes to the left, and never touches on things like cohesion or theming or character writing, except for as a footnote, an afterthought, rather than as one of the main reasons for its failure. What proves this to me is the insistence that Xander, for example, is especially inconsistent despite the fact that there are other characters that are just as bad or worse about it, or this weird spite-driven attitude that Takumi was right about everything because he dislikes a character people thought was annoying, or this idea that Corin simply shouldn't have chosen Nor, or they should have just not allowed the massacre at Sheev, and the characters should have all just known to make the right decisions. And I'm not trying to be all like, well, everyone else is simply wrong, or tout myself as being immune to this, or having better opinions than everyone else. My opinions are fucking garbage, that much was obvious by now. But media literacy begins to die when everyone hears that something sucks and immediately takes it as gospel. I think it's because it's such a mishmash of varying degrees of quality that I find it difficult to simply forget about. It's not something you can disregard completely because there are absolutely things to like here, but that also makes it frustrating. I wish this game was better. I wish I could truly fall in love with this world and these characters and this story, but it is so relentlessly bogged down by its writing. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my stupid fucking yapping.